Hello there and welcome to Biology with Charles, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to sleep. Tonight, we're settling in with a question that sneaks up on nearly everyone sooner or later. Why does time seem to speed up as you get older? Somehow, a summer in childhood could feel enormous, while now an entire year can slip past so quickly that it seems to vanish almost as soon as it arrives. It is a strange thing, really. The clocks are not hurrying. The days are still 24 hours long. January does not secretly shrink just because you now pay bills and answer emails, and yet the feeling is hard to ignore. Time can begin to behave like a polite but suspiciously efficient waiter, clearing away whole weeks before you feel you've properly sat down with them. Before we ease into this gentle little mystery, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is in your corner of the world right now. It feels fitting, doesn't it, to begin a story about time by noticing the hour itself. And if you find this soothing, interesting, or simply a pleasant way to slow down after a long day, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this quiet space reach other people who might need a calm place to land. Now, get comfortable, let your thoughts unclench a little, and we'll begin with something many people feel long before they ever try to explain it. The sense that time, somewhere along the way, starts moving faster. Most people do not notice this all at once. It is not usually the sort of thing that happens on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:17 p.m. with a dramatic musical cue in the background. It arrives more quietly than that. You might notice that birthdays come around sooner than they used to. Holidays seem to appear just after the decorations from the last one were put away. You glance at the calendar and realise it is somehow autumn again, even though you are fairly certain it was only just spring. There is often a moment of mild disbelief attached to it, a small internal pause that says, "Surely not already." And then you carry on because dinner still needs making and laundry continues its ancient campaign against human peace. What makes this feeling so interesting is that it is widespread. People across many cultures and ages report some version of it. Children often feel that time moves slowly, especially when they are waiting for something. Waiting for a birthday can feel like an era. Waiting for summer can feel longer than the actual season itself. A car journey can seem endless. A school year can feel almost geological in scale. But later in life, time often begins to feel condensed. Months pass quickly. Years blur. People start saying things they once heard adults say and swore they never would, such as, "I can't believe how fast this year has gone." So what is going on here? Why should our experience of time change so much when the clocks do not? The answer begins with something important. The time you feel is not exactly the same as the time a clock measures. Clock time is stable, it is external, it marches along second by second whether you're bored in a waiting room or laughing through dinner with friends. But psychological time, the time as you live it, is something else. It is shaped by attention, memory, emotion, routine, biology, and expectation. In other words, the human experience of time is less like reading numbers off a device, and more like your brain building a story about change. That story can be stretched, compressed, highlighted, blurred, and rearranged in ways that make life feel very different from how it looks on paper. One afternoon can seem to last forever while it is happening, yet disappear quickly in memory. A vacation may fly by in the moment, but feel rich and spacious when you look back on it. A difficult year can feel endless as you live through it, and strangely brief once it is over. The brain does not keep time the way a machine does, it interprets it. This is where the topic becomes surprisingly human. When people say that time speeds up as they get older, they are not usually describing a physical change in the universe. They are describing a change in experience. The internal sense of time begins to shift. The days may still be made of the same number of hours, but the mind no longer handles them in quite the same way. One of the simplest ways to understand this is to think about what the brain is doing when it tries to register life. Your mind is not just watching the world go by. It is selecting, sorting, storing, and comparing. It pays attention to what seems important. It notices novelty, it responds to emotion, it builds memories, and these processes influence the feeling of time more than most people realize. Take childhood, for instance. When you're very young, almost everything is new. New places, new people, new routines, new words, new foods, new rules, new confusions, new embarrassments, new joys. The brain is processing an enormous amount of unfamiliar information. It is learning the structure of the world from the ground up. And when experience is new, the mind tends to record more of it. There is simply more to notice, more details to absorb, more little events that stand out because they are not yet part of a familiar pattern. This matters because novelty often makes time feel fuller. A day packed with firsts contains more mental markers than a day made of repeated routine. When there are more mental markers, experience can feel richer, larger, and more extended. Childhood is full of these markers. The first day at new school, the first time riding a bicycle without help, the first sleepover, the first holiday you vividly remember. Even a simple trip to the supermarket can feel eventful when you are small, and the world is still oversized and only partly understood. As people grow older, life usually becomes more structured. This is not necessarily bad. Routine has many virtues. It keeps life manageable. It lowers stress in some ways. It allows competence to develop. You no longer need to treat every small task as an expedition into the unknown. You know how to get through a work week, how to shop for groceries, how to answer the phone, how to make tea, how to survive a Tuesday. This is useful. It is efficient. It is also, from the perspective of the brain's timekeeping story, less dense. When experience becomes familiar, the brain can process it with less effort and often records fewer distinct details. That does not mean nothing is happening. It means much of it no longer stands out sharply. Days begin to resemble one another. Weeks develop patterns. The mind starts compressing similar experiences together, and when memory becomes more compressed, time can feel as though it has passed more quickly. That last part is important. One of the reasons time seems to speed up is that we often judge it not only while we are living it, but afterward, by the shape of memory. If a stretch of life contains many distinct events, many memorable moments, many changes, it can seem long in retrospect. If it contains repetition and fewer standout markers, it can seem short in retrospect, even if it was not especially brief while you were living it. Think of it like shelves in an archive. A year filled with change, travel, learning, emotional intensity, and new experiences may occupy several shelves. There is a lot stored there. A year dominated by routine may fit into fewer boxes. When you look back, one feels expansive and the other feels compact. The calendar says both were the same length. The brain disagrees. This is one reason adulthood can begin to feel accelerated. The mind becomes more skilled, more selective, and less surprised. A child may experience one December as vast because every part of it feels vivid and charged with meaning. An adult may arrive at New Year's Day wondering how December disappeared into shopping lists, emails, travel plans, and the annual negotiation with wrapping paper. The month was not shorter. It was simply handled differently by attention and memory. There is another layer to this, and it has to do with proportion. Even without any neuroscience, many people intuitively notice that a year feels different at age 5 than it does at age 50. When you're 5, 1 year is 1/5 of your entire life. That is a large portion. When you're 50, 1 year is 1/50th. Relative to everything you've already lived, it is a smaller slice. Some psychologists and philosophers have pointed to this ratio effect as part of the explanation. Each passing year makes up less of your total experience, so subjectively it may feel smaller. This idea has limits, but it captures something real about human perspective. We do not experience time in a vacuum. We experience it against the background of what has already been lived. A month in early childhood can feel immense, because there is so little previous time for it to be compared against. Later on, the same month takes its place in a much larger mental landscape. It does not dominate experience in quite the same way. Still, proportion alone does not explain everything. After all, not every adult feels time speeding up at the same rate, and not every child feels life unfolding slowly all the time. Context matters, attention matters, emotion matters, routine matters. A stressful month may feel both long and short. Long while you're in it, short once it becomes one more blur in a crowded year. A joyful but highly repetitive period may pass quickly in memory. A difficult but highly unusual period may remain vividly expanded for years. There's also the matter of attention in the present moment. When you pay close attention to time, it often seems to slow down. When you're waiting, for example, each minute can feel unreasonably proud of itself, waiting for test results, waiting for guests to arrive, waiting for a kettle to boil, waiting for someone to text back after you have decided not to care, but very much do care anyway. In these moments, attention is drawn toward the passage of time itself. The mind is watching, it counts the delay, and time seems to stretch. By contrast, when attention is absorbed elsewhere, time often seems to pass quickly. Hours disappear in conversation, work, reading, music, cooking, walking, or simply doing something that catches the mind fully. You're not monitoring time, so it slips by with less resistance. This happens throughout life, of course, but adulthood often includes longer periods of divided or externally directed attention, especially when responsibilities pile up. You move from task to task. The week gets partitioned by obligations, and before you know it, Friday is back, smiling faintly like it knew this would happen. Emotion shapes the picture too. Intense feelings can distort time dramatically. Fear can make moments feel longer. Joy can make them seem to flash by. Anxiety can trap attention on passing minutes. Sadness can create heavy stretches of slow experience. Anticipation can lengthen the wait before an event and shorten the event itself once it arrives. The human sense of time is not objective. It is saturated with feeling. This is worth lingering over because aging is not simply the accumulation of years. It is also the accumulation of emotional patterns, responsibilities, expectations, and mental habits. A child does not usually organize time the way an adult does. Children are often rooted more deeply in immediate experience. Adults, by contrast, are frequently thinking ahead, remembering behind, managing deadlines, comparing schedules, and evaluating what has or has not been done. This can change the texture of lived time. When life becomes heavily scheduled, it can begin to feel chopped into functional pieces: morning routine, commute, work, lunch, more work, errands, dinner, cleanup, messages, maybe a little rest, sleep, repeat. The structure helps keep things moving, but it can also encourage compression. The brain recognizes the pattern and stops treating each part as a fresh event. The result is efficiency, but also sameness. And sameness is one of the quiet engines behind the feeling that time is speeding up. Not because sameness makes the clock move faster, but because it reduces the number of distinct impressions the mind uses to build the sense of duration. Life becomes easier to process, and in some ways, easier to overlook. You can move through weeks successfully and still feel as though you were only half present for them. This is one reason people often report that time seems to slow down during travel, major life changes, or periods of intense learning. In those times, the mind is pushed out of automatic mode. It has to pay attention again. It has to notice. A new city, a new language, a new job, a new friendship, a new skill, a new grief, a new role as a parent, a move, a loss, a love, a diagnosis, a reinvention. These things puncture routine. They create landmarks in memory. They make time feel full again, sometimes uncomfortably so, but undeniably full. That does not mean the goal is to live in constant novelty. No one wants every week to feel like assembling flat-pack furniture in a foreign language, while being emotionally evaluated by a goat. The point is simply that the brain seems to use difference, richness, and attention as ingredients in the feeling of lived time. When those ingredients decrease, time can begin to feel thin and fast. There is even a biological aspect to consider. As we age, our bodies and brains change in ways that may influence temporal perception. Metabolism shifts, processing speed changes, attention changes, sleep changes, stress changes. The internal rhythms of life are not static. Some researchers have suggested that changes in neural processing speed may contribute to the sense that time moves differently with age, though this is still an area of ongoing discussion. The general idea is that if the brain processes fewer novel impressions in a given span, that span may feel shorter or less eventful. Even without settling every scientific detail, the broad picture remains persuasive. Time feels faster as we get older, not because time itself has altered, but because our relationship with experience has changed. The mind becomes more practiced, life becomes more patterned, memory becomes more selective. Each year becomes a smaller fraction of all that has been lived. The world is still moving at the same pace, but we are no longer encountering it with the same freshness. There is something a little bittersweet in that, but it is not entirely bad news. In fact, once you understand that the speeding up of time is partly about how the brain attends to life, it opens an interesting possibility. Perhaps the feeling of time can be influenced. Perhaps it is not fully fixed. Perhaps some of what makes years vanish is not age alone, but habit. Perhaps some of what made childhood feel spacious was not youth by itself, but attention, novelty, and immersion. That idea matters because it takes the subject out of the realm of hopeless complaint and into the realm of quiet understanding. When people say, "The years go by too fast," they're usually expressing something real. But beneath that feeling lies a set of processes that can be observed, and maybe to some extent gently reshaped. Not by forcing life into constant excitement, and not by trying to outsmart the calendar, but by understanding how experience becomes memory, and how memory becomes the feeling of a life. For tonight, though, it is enough just to notice the first clue. The sensation that time accelerates with age is not foolish, dramatic, or imagined. It is part of being human. It arises from the way the brain builds the flow of experience out of attention, routine, novelty, feeling, and memory. Childhood often seems long not because the world was objectively slower, but because the mind was collecting it in larger handfuls. Adulthood often seems quicker, not because the universe is rushing, but because the mind has learned to package life more efficiently, sometimes too efficiently for comfort. And once you begin to see that, a great many familiar things start making more sense. Why old summers seem impossibly long in memory, why recent years can blur together, why a single unusual trip can feel bigger than several normal months, why a repetitive week disappears while a surprising afternoon lingers. The clock on the wall remains innocent in all this. It has been doing the same thing all along. The real story is unfolding elsewhere, in the mind that watches, selects, stores, compares, and quietly decides whether a season felt like a world or merely passed by on its way to something else. So as we move further into this, the next step is to look more closely at that earlier part of life, when time seemed wider, slower, and somehow more available. Because childhood did not only feel different by accident. There are reasons those early years often seem stretched and spacious, and the brain has quite a lot to do with that. When people look back on childhood, one of the most common things they notice is not just what happened, but how large it all felt while it was happening. A summer seemed enormous. A school year felt like it had the structural weight of a geological era. Waiting a week for something special could feel almost unreasonable, as if time itself had personally decided to be difficult. Even ordinary afternoons often seemed to contain more space than they do now. There was room in them somehow. Room for boredom, room for invention, room for long stretches of noticing things that adults often stop noticing entirely. And this raises a very gentle but surprisingly deep question. Why did those years feel so wide? Why did childhood seem to unfold at such a different pace from adult life, even though the same clocks were ticking on the wall, and the same sun was taking its time across the sky. Part of the answer is simple enough to say, even if it reaches into many layers of psychology and biology. Childhood felt longer because the brain was meeting the world in a very different way. It was not just younger, it was newer. It was encountering more things for the first time, paying attention in a different pattern, storing experience with a different texture, and living with a looser relationship to schedules, productivity, and abstract time. A child does not usually move through life by mentally checking calendar boxes and estimating how many emails are waiting. A child is often much more immersed in the immediate shape of experience, and that changes the feeling of time more than most people realize. To understand this, it helps to start with novelty. Children live in a world crowded with firsts. The first time sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. The first time seeing snow and trying to decide whether it looks more like magic or inconvenience. The first time getting lost in a shop for what feels like half a lifetime but is probably 90 seconds. The first day of school, the first bus ride alone, the first friendship that feels permanent, the first embarrassment that feels equally permanent, the first time noticing that adults are not always right, only louder. Childhood is full of these moments. Even ordinary life is full of unfamiliar things because the child has not yet built a thick library of repeated experience. The brain responds strongly to novelty. When something is new, attention increases, perception sharpens, memory becomes more likely to form rich details. The mind has to work harder because it cannot rely on an old template. It has to look, compare, interpret, and store. In practical terms, this means that a child's day is often more densely packed with meaningful impressions than an adult's day, even when the adult is objectively doing more. That density matters. When the brain stores more distinct impressions, the experience later feels larger. The day has more mental furniture in it, so to speak. More corners, more shelves, more things left behind in memory. Adults sometimes assume that children experience time slowly because they are impatient, and that is partly true. Waiting does feel especially long when your emotional regulation is still under construction, and your sense of the future is rather foggy. But impatience is only part of it. The larger reason is that the child is living in an environment that feels expansive because it is less familiar. The brain is not compressing events efficiently yet. It is still building the map. Think of what happens when you walk a new route through a city you have never visited. You notice each turn. The buildings stand out. The signs feel distinct. The street seems longer because the brain is actively mapping it. On the way back, the same route often feels shorter. The novelty has faded. The uncertainty is lower. The map already exists in some usable form. Childhood has more of that first journey quality. Adulthood has more of the return trip effect. The world is not literally shorter the second time. It is just less mentally expensive to travel through. This is one reason early memories can seem so big in retrospect. A single holiday at age 7 may occupy more psychological space than several similar holidays later in life. A particular classroom, a particular smell of crayons or wet coats, a specific patch of sunlight on a floor, the colour of a playground gate, the unbearable length of 10 minutes before lunchtime. All of this can remain strangely vivid. The brain was taking it in with the seriousness of a system still learning how the world works. Later on, because so much of life is already known, fewer details are granted that level of attention. Attention itself is another crucial part of the story. Children often tend to experience differently from adults. Their attention can be unstable in some ways, of course. Anyone who has watched a child abandon one idea halfway through to become intensely committed to a stick understands this well. But when children are engaged, they can also become deeply absorbed in what is directly in front of them. Not in the polished, productivity-friendly sense adults like to call focus, but in a more total, immersive sense. The puddle is not a puddle to be stepped around efficiently. It is a world event. The ant is not a small insect carrying on with its day. It is a mystery. A cardboard box is not packaging. It is architecture, transport, shelter, imagination, and possibly a submarine. This style of attention changes the texture of time. When experience is richly inhabited, it feels fuller, not necessarily slower in the clock sense, but bigger in the lived sense. Children often inhabit moments more thoroughly because they are not always measuring them against the next obligation. Adults, by contrast, frequently divide attention between the present and whatever is coming next. Even in pleasant moments, there is often a little manager in the back of the mind saying things like, "This is nice, but remember to send that message," or "We should leave in 20 minutes," or "Tomorrow will be busy." Children are not free of anticipation, of course, especially when waiting for cake or cartoons or Christmas morning. But much of the time they are less governed by the adult habit of structuring every hour in relation to future tasks. This matters because adult time is often thinly spread across multiple mental layers. You're in the present, but also partly in tomorrow, partly in your obligations, partly in the administrative sadness of remembering that yogurt expires. Childhood is more often immediate. The now occupies more of the stage. That can make experience feel larger because it is less diluted by scheduling. There is also the matter of how children understand time conceptually. Very young children do not grasp time in the same structured way adults do. Words like later, soon, next week, next month, and in a little while do not initially carry precise meaning. To a small child, 5 minutes and 50 minutes may both belong to the broad category of not now, which is frankly unacceptable. Time is felt more through routines, bodily states, light, hunger, waiting, and repetition than through abstract units. This can make durations feel enormous because they are not yet nestled inside a mature framework of measurement. A day is not one of many standardized units in a long organized life. It is just today, and today can feel very big indeed. Anyone who has told a child, "We'll go after lunch," knows that this may be received as a statement of mythical vagueness. After lunch might as well be next spring, not because the child is irrational, but because their mental model of time is still forming. Adults often forget how much of their own sense of time depends on conceptual scaffolding. We know what a week is, we know what an hour can hold. We have internalized the shape of calendars, work days, weekends, and seasons. These structures help us organize life, but they also compress it. A Monday in October may become just one square among many. Childhood has fewer such squares and much blurrier edges around them. That blurriness is not always confusion. Sometimes it is spaciousness. A child in summer may not care whether it is July 12th or July 19th. What matters is that there is light, air, movement, maybe boredom, maybe freedom, maybe the smell of grass or sunscreen or dust in a quiet room. Without a heavily partitioned schedule, days can feel less segmented and more expansive. Adults often carve time into useful blocks, morning tasks, afternoon meetings, evening plans. This helps life function. It also means time arrives pre-sliced. Childhood often contains longer undivided stretches, particularly in memory. Those stretches can feel almost physically larger when recalled later. Boredom, interestingly, plays a role too. Adults tend to treat boredom as a problem to be solved immediately, often by reaching for a screen, a task, a plan, or a snack. Children, especially in earlier eras or less managed environments, often spent more time in open boredom. This is not always enjoyable in the moment. A bored child can produce the kind of sigh that suggests history itself has become unbearable. But boredom stretches time, when nothing much is happening and attention has nowhere satisfying to go. The mind becomes very aware of duration. Minutes lengthen, afternoons expand, and then, out of that boredom, imagination often begins to work. A chair becomes a fort, a hallway becomes a racetrack, a spoon becomes a microphone, a garden becomes unexplored territory. In this way, boredom both stretches time and gives rise to the kind of self-generated play that makes childhood experience memorable. Adults, by contrast, are often less likely to dwell in boredom long enough for it to transform. we interrupt it quickly. That has advantages, certainly. It is difficult to maintain modern life if one responds to every dull moment by building a blanket kingdom and refusing to answer to any authority. But it also means that many adult days are smoother, more managed, and less punctuated by the slow, empty spaces that once made time feel long. Emotion is another important clue. Childhood emotions are often immediate and large. Joy can be complete, fear can be total. Embarrassment can feel terminal. Excitement before a birthday or holiday can make waiting feel almost physically heavy. These strong feelings shape time perception. Anticipation stretches the days before an event. Disappointment can make an afternoon drag. Delight can make an hour sparkle in memory. Because children often have less practiced emotional regulation and less experience contextualizing what they feel, emotions can saturate time more fully. An adult may feel annoyed at a delay while also thinking, well, this is inconvenient but not the end of civilization. A child may experience the same delay as a genuine injustice at the level of the cosmos. That emotional saturation gives moments weight. It makes them memorable. It also makes time feel bigger. Childhood is not slow simply because children have fewer responsibilities. It is slow because experiences often land with greater novelty and greater emotional force. Memory formation itself changes with age as well. The developing brain is not just smaller or less informed than an adult brain. It is organized differently, learning at enormous speed, building categories, associations and expectations from ongoing experience. Early life involves a tremendous amount of encoding. Language, social rules, physical coordination, emotional patterns, environmental cues, basic assumptions about safety and meaning. The brain is constructing a world model from the ground up. When so much is under construction, experience tends to be processed with a certain intensity. This does not mean that children remember everything clearly forever. In fact, most adults have very few memories from the earliest years of life, a phenomenon often called childhood amnesia. But once stable autobiographical memory begins to take shape, the years that follow can feel especially vivid, because the system is still learning what matters and how to store it. Later in life, once those categories are more established, repeated experiences may be recorded less distinctly. They are understood faster, which is efficient, but they may leave a lighter trace. This helps explain why childhood summers can seem so enormous in memory. Not every day was packed with historic importance. Quite a lot of it may have involved melted ice cream, strange hobbies, mosquito bites, and lying on the floor for reasons now unclear. But because the experiences were embedded in a world still being learned, they often acquired texture. The days were not always interesting, but they were less compressed. There is also an environmental factor worth noticing. Many children live with more externally structured seasons and milestones. School terms, birthdays, holidays, growth spurts, new abilities, changing friendships, visible developmental changes, losing teeth, learning to read, outgrowing shoes at a frankly rude pace. Childhood is marked by obvious change. You're not just living through time, you're visibly becoming different. This gives years a pronounced shape. Adults change too, sometimes profoundly, but often with fewer clear ceremonial markers. One year of adulthood can look surprisingly similar to the next from the outside, especially if work and routine dominate. Childhood, by contrast, is full of built-in transitions. Those transitions help segment memory and make time feel richly eventful. Even size and scale may contribute in a modest but interesting way. The physical world literally appears larger to children. Rooms are bigger, distances are longer, adults are taller, doors heavier, supermarkets more exhausting, staircases apparently designed by mountain engineers. This is not the main reason time feels different, but it adds to the general sense that life is spacious and substantial. When the world itself feels big, moving through it can feel more extended. A walk that an adult barely notices may feel like a full expedition to a child. The hallway to bed at night can seem to contain enough darkness and possibility to qualify as a heroic journey. Then there is the matter of routine, or rather the relative absence of adult-style routine. Children do have routines, of course, and often rely on them, but they are not usually the architects of those routines. They do not spend the day optimizing systems, coordinating calendars, and reproducing similar task sequences for years on end. Adult routine has a special talent for compression because it encourages autopilot. You wake, wash, prepare, commute, respond, complete, return, repeat. There may be pleasure in this, or competence, or exhaustion, or all three at once. But the repetition makes individual days less distinct in memory. Childhood contains more guidance from others, certainly, but often less self-imposed efficiency. There is more wandering, more lingering, more resistance, more drift, more direct engagement with whatever is happening now. Of course, not every childhood is idyllic, and not every child experiences time as spacious in a comforting way. Difficult childhoods can make time feel painfully slow. Uncertainty, fear, neglect, or instability can stretch days into exhausting lengths. So when speaking about childhood feeling endless, it is important not to pretend this was universally joyful. What is broadly true is that childhood often feels large. That largeness may be magical, boring, overwhelming, or all mixed together. The point is not that childhood was always better, it is that it was often psychologically wider. Adults sometimes mourn this widening without quite knowing what they are mourning. They say they miss how summers used to feel, or how holidays once seemed to take forever to arrive, or how there was more time then. But often what they really miss is not the objective quantity of time, it is the mode of perception. They miss living in a world that still felt unsorted, unsummarized, and not yet compressed by familiarity. They miss the richness of first encounters, the long corridors of waiting, the detailed textures of small things. They miss a mind that had not yet become so efficient at skipping ahead. Efficiency, after all, is both a gift and a thief. It helps adults survive busy lives. It lets us move competently through familiar terrain. But it can also cause the mind to file away large portions of life under labels like usual, known, routine, nothing special. And once enough of life gets filed that way, years begin to feel alarmingly light. Childhood had less of that filing, it had more raw footage. This is one reason new experiences in adulthood can temporarily bring back that older feeling of spaciousness. Travel, learning a skill, falling in love, becoming a parent, moving house, changing career paths, even simply walking a different route home with full attention. These things can interrupt compression. They can make the brain wake up and start recording with more detail again. The days do not actually become longer, but they may start to feel less slippery. Still, the point here is not to turn adulthood into a project of desperately trying to recreate being 8 years old. That would be exhausting and rather hard on everyone around you. The point is to notice that the first big clue in the mystery of speeding time lies in childhood itself. Childhood felt endless because it was full of firsts, full of attention, full of uncompressed experience, full of emotion, and less governed by the tight conceptual scaffolding adults use to organize time. The days felt larger because the brain was encountering more, storing more, and inhabiting the present more fully. Once you see that, a great many familiar memories begin to make sense. Why waiting for a birthday once felt almost intolerable. Why 6 weeks of summer holiday seemed like a whole civilization. Why a short walk to a friend's house could contain drama, weather, discoveries, and at least one deeply important stick. Why one Christmas could feel like an age and one school term like a continent. Childhood was not objectively longer, it was experientially denser, and that density is important because it leads us toward the next piece of the puzzle. If childhood felt large partly because the brain was measuring time through rich, detailed experience, then adulthood may feel faster, partly because the brain measures time through memory in a different way. Which means the next thing to look at is not the clock, but the brain's own method of keeping track. Not by ticking, but by recording, sorting, and later asking itself how much life seems to have happened. One of the strangest things about time is that we do not really experience it directly. We experience events, changes, feelings, sensations, and thoughts, and then the brain quietly builds a sense of duration out of those pieces. This means that the feeling of how long something lasted is often less about the clock itself, and more about how much experience the mind believes it has gathered along the way. In other words, the brain does not simply read time like a number on a screen. It estimates it through experience. It measures time partly by what happened, how much stood out, what was stored in memory, and how densely that stretch of life seems packed when we look back on it. This is one of the central clues in why time seems to speed up as people get older. If the brain uses memory as part of its internal method for judging duration, then anything that changes how memory is formed, sorted, or recalled can alter the feeling of time passing. And memory, unlike a stopwatch, is selective, emotional, messy, practical, biased, and deeply human. It keeps some things in crisp detail and lets others dissolve into a sort of administrative fog. It can make one afternoon from 20 years ago feel vivid and immediate while allowing 3 nearly identical weeks from last month to merge into a single blur of coffee cups, traffic lights, and asking yourself what day it is. To understand this properly, it helps to separate 2 related but different experiences of time. There is the way time feels while you're living through it, and there is the way it seems in retrospect once it has already passed. Those are not always the same. A holiday may feel as though it went by far too quickly in the moment, and yet when you look back on it, it can seem large and full because it left behind many memorable details. By contrast, an ordinary work week may feel slow enough while you're in the middle of it, especially around Wednesday afternoon when your patience has the consistency of dry toast. But later that same week may seem to have disappeared almost instantly because it left behind fewer distinct memory markers. This is the memory effect in a very practical form. The brain often judges how much time seems to have passed by how much content it can find. Not exactly in a strict numerical sense, as though it is counting memories like coins in a jar, but in a broader experiential sense. If a period of life contains many distinct impressions, many notable events, many changes in place, mood, activity, or attention, then that period often feels longer in hindsight. If it contains repeated routines, few surprises, and little that stands apart, it often feels shorter in hindsight, even when it was not especially short at the time. This is why novelty matters so much. When something is new, the brain tends to devote more attention to it. New environments, new people, new skills, new routes, new mistakes, new foods, new anxieties, new pleasures. These things are not processed as background. They are processed as information requiring effort. The mind has to notice more because it cannot rely on a fully formed template. It must build one, and when it does that, more details are often encoded into memory. Once experience becomes familiar, the brain grows more efficient. Efficiency is useful. It allows life to move along without requiring full conscious analysis of every spoon, staircase, and supermarket aisle. But efficiency comes with compression. Familiar experiences are often handled with less attention and encoded with less richness. You do not need to study the route to work each morning if you have taken it hundreds of times. You do not need to build a fresh mental model of making tea if you have done it so often that your body could probably manage it while your mind is busy regretting a message you sent in 2017. The brain saves energy by treating repeated experiences as already known. This is one of the reasons adulthood can feel accelerated. Much of adult life is built from repeated structures. Wake up, get ready, work, commute, eat, wash, repeat. Even when life contains variation, the general framework may remain stable for years. Stability can be comforting. It can also produce compression in memory. If many days are broadly similar, then when the brain looks back, it does not find as many distinct markers separating one day from the next. Experience gets bundled. Imagine a shelf of files in an archive. A highly varied month might produce many separate folders, each clearly labelled with particular places, conversations, emotions, and surprises. A repetitive month might be placed mostly into one thick folder labelled more or less usual. When you later ask yourself where that time went, the answer is hidden in the filing system. It did not vanish. It was simply stored in a more compressed form. This is not a flaw in the brain. It is a feature of an efficient system. If the mind recorded every detail of every repeated event with equal weight, daily life would be overwhelming. The brain needs shortcuts. It needs categories. It needs a way to say, yes, I know this type of Tuesday. But the side effect is that familiar stretches of time feel smaller in retrospect than novel ones. Less appears to have happened, even when plenty did happen in the practical sense. Psychologists sometimes talk about memory in terms of event segmentation. The brain naturally divides experience into units or episodes. Walking into a new room, starting a conversation, driving somewhere unfamiliar, beginning a meal, ending a task, arriving at a destination. These shifts help the brain organize memory. When there are more clear segments, a period may later feel fuller. When there are fewer, or when segments are repetitive and blur together, a period may feel flatter and shorter. Think of the difference between a day spent travelling through several unfamiliar places and a day spent completing familiar tasks in familiar surroundings. The travel day may feel chaotic or tiring in the moment, and perhaps you will swear at some point that it has lasted a century. But later it often seems substantial. It contains landmarks. The ordinary task day may feel manageable, perhaps even calm, but later it may barely stand apart from the days around it. The clock gave both days the same number of hours. Memory did not give them the same shape. There is also the way emotion influences memory formation. Emotion acts like a highlighter. Events that carry joy, fear, embarrassment, grief, anticipation, or even very specific annoyance are often encoded more strongly than neutral ones. This is one reason emotionally vivid moments can seem large in memory. A brief but intense experience may occupy a disproportionate amount of mental space years later, because the brain treated it as important. The memory is denser, more detailed, more retrievable. This effect can make time behave strangely. A frightening few seconds can feel much longer in retrospect because the brain recorded them with unusual intensity. A deeply joyful evening can feel as if it passed in a flash while you were living it, yet feel expansive later because it remains vivid. Emotional salience enriches memory, and enriched memory expands retrospective time. The duration you feel in the moment and the duration you infer later are not always built from the same ingredients. In everyday life, much of what makes time seem fast in adulthood is not just routine by itself, but routine with low emotional distinction. A week in which each day carries only mild variations of the same obligations may leave behind a thin trail in memory. You were there. You worked, ate, answered, folded, remembered, forgot, continued. But when looking back, the brain may retrieve the whole stretch as a general impression rather than a series of distinct lived moments. The week becomes a paragraph when it was once 7 separate pages. This is part of why childhood and adolescence often feel so much longer in retrospect than equivalent spans later in life. Those earlier years contain more firsts, more transitions, more changes in identity, more emotionally charged events, more obvious personal growth, and more novel environments. The brain has more to work with when it reconstructs them. There are more markers, more segments, more rich sensory and emotional details. Even small events stand out because they occurred in a world that still felt largely unsorted. Adulthood is often less event-dense in that sense, especially during periods of strong routine. There may still be meaningful things happening, certainly. Work can matter, relationships matter, Quiet habits matter, but if much of life unfolds in familiar patterns, the brain may encode it more economically. That economy shows up later as speed, not because the time was objectively shorter, but because the reconstruction is lighter. Reconstruction is the right word here, because memory is not a perfect recording. It is not like opening a vault and retrieving an untouched film reel. Remembering is more like rebuilding a scene from selected pieces. The brain keeps fragments, themes, sensations, narrative links, and emotional tones. It fills gaps, it simplifies, it organizes. Every time you remember something, you're not merely replaying it, you're actively reconstructing it. That means the sense of how long a period lasted is also a kind of reconstruction. It is judgment, an impression, a story the brain tells about density and change. This helps explain a common experience. People often say that a recent year went by very fast, but a year containing major life changes seems much larger when recalled. Consider a year in which someone moved house, started a new job, travelled, fell in love, learned something difficult, faced a family crisis, and changed their daily habits. That year may have been exhausting, but it rarely feels empty in memory. There are too many points of difference. The brain can see its shape. Now compare that with a year dominated by repeated tasks and few fresh landmarks. Even if it was busy, it may feel oddly insubstantial when recalled. The difference lies not in the calendar but in memory architecture. The mind is asking itself more or less how much happened here that required separate storage, separate attention, separate narrative weight. A richer answer produces a longer feeling stretch. A thinner answer produces a shorter feeling one. There is a simple, everyday example of this. Imagine 2 weekends. In one, you stay home, do the same chores you often do, watch familiar things, and move through your standard rhythm. In the other, you take a day trip somewhere unfamiliar, eat in a different place, walk through streets you do not know, talk with people you do not usually see, maybe get slightly lost, perhaps spend too much on something unnecessary but memorable. During both weekends, time may pass at an ordinary pace, but by Monday, the second weekend often feels as though it contained more life. By the following month, it may still stand out while the first one has blended with several others. The second weekend produced a broader memory footprint. This broader footprint is one of the brain's hidden measuring tools. The more footprint, the more duration seems to have existed there. Again, not mathematically, not perfectly, but experientially. Another important detail is that attention in the present influences what later becomes memory. If you move through a day distracted, multitasking constantly, glancing half-heartedly at one thing while mentally rehearsing another, then fewer details are likely to be encoded strongly. Later, the day may seem to have slipped away. By contrast, if attention is more concentrated, even ordinary experiences can become more memorable. A walk noticed fully may leave more trace than a day rushed through unconsciously. Attention gives memory material, and memory gives time shape. This is why mindfulness, reflection, journaling, photography, conversation, travel, learning, and other forms of deliberate noticing can sometimes make life feel fuller. They do not stop the clock. They increase the chance that experience will be encoded with enough detail to resist compression later. The brain cannot reconstruct what it barely registered. There is also a biological side to this. Memory formation depends on networks involving the hippocampus and other brain regions that help encode and organize experience. These systems are shaped by stress, sleep, age, novelty, and emotion. Chronic stress, for instance, can narrow attention and reduce the richness of memory formation in some cases, even while making certain emotionally charged details more sticky. Poor sleep can impair encoding. Exhaustion can make days pass in a fog. A life that is constantly overloaded may produce the strange combination of feeling rushed all the time while remembering very little distinctly afterward. This is important because many adults live precisely in that combination. The days feel fast while they happen, because attention is fragmented and obligations are continuous. The months feel even faster in retrospect because not enough distinct memory markers were formed. One becomes busy but thinly registered. A week can be full of activity and still leave behind surprisingly little mental structure. Children, by contrast, often produce stronger memory density from simple things because the world is still saturated with novelty and because the tasks of life are not yet so heavily organised around abstract productivity. A trip to a relative's house, a new television show, a bruise from climbing something ill-advised, a specific day of rain, a birthday cake with a design that now seems suspiciously ambitious, all of these can become strong markers. In adulthood, similar small events are more likely to be absorbed into an existing template unless something forces them to stand apart. This is why repeated celebrations can seem to come closer together over time. The first few are distinct. Later ones may be organised under a category. Another Christmas, another birthday, another summer. Unless something happens to distinguish one sharply from another, the brain compresses them. Years begin to lose some of their internal edges. Notice that this is not the same as saying adulthood is less meaningful. Meaning and memorability are not identical. A stable adult life may be deeply meaningful and still feel accelerated because stability encourages compression. Raising children, caring for others, showing up to work, maintaining friendships, protecting routines, keeping a household together, these things can be profoundly important. But because they are often repeated acts rather than isolated dramatic moments, they may not always expand retrospective time in the same way novelty does. This can create a peculiar sadness where the most meaningful parts of life are not always the parts that feel largest in memory. Yet even here, memory can be shaped by how attention is given. Repeated acts do not have to vanish entirely into compression. Distinct details, emotional presence, and conscious reflection can help separate them. A meal is not just a meal if it is actually noticed. A walk is not just a walk if something about it is registered. The brain needs distinctions to build longer feeling time, and distinctions can be found even in familiar life if attention allows it. There is also the matter of narrative. Human beings remember in story form. We do not merely store isolated data. We connect events into arcs. We remember beginnings, middles, endings, turning points, and meanings. A stretch of time that fits into a clear personal story may feel more substantial than one that does not. That was the year I learned to live alone. That was the summer I kept taking the train to the coast. That was the season when everything changed. Narratively rich periods are easier to retrieve, and retrieval contributes to the sense that more time was there. Repetitive periods can lack narrative contrast. That was a busy year. That was when work was a lot. Such descriptions are not false, but they do not provide many hooks for memory. Without hooks, the brain retrieves less, and less retrieval often feels like less time. This helps explain why reflecting on life sometimes changes the feeling of it. Looking through old photos, writing in detail about a past season, telling stories to a friend, revisiting places, even smelling something that unlocks a forgotten room in memory. All of these can suddenly expand a period that had seemed small. The time was always there, but access to it was limited. Memory is not just storage, it is availability. A period of life can feel fast partly because its details are not easy to retrieve. And this brings us back to the central point. The brain measures time through experience not in the clean, reliable way a clock measures seconds, but through the richness, distinctiveness, emotional salience and retrievability of what has been lived. Memory is one of the hidden rulers behind the feeling of duration. More markers, more segments, more vivid details, more accessible stories, and time tends to look larger. Fewer markers, more repetition, less attention, and time tends to collapse inward. So when people say that life seems to speed up as they get older, part of what they are feeling is the effect of memory compression. The brain has become efficient. Experience has become more patterned. Many days are stored in summary form. The result is that months and years can seem to vanish because the mind finds fewer distinct traces when it looks back. The lovely thing, if there is one, is that this suggests time perception is not completely beyond influence. While no one can return to childhood or force every week to become a dramatic montage of first experiences, it is possible to understand what the brain responds to. Attention helps, novelty helps, emotional presence helps, reflection helps, distinctions help. The brain measures time through what it can meaningfully register, and what it can meaningfully register depends partly on how life is lived and noticed. This does not mean one must turn existence into a relentless search for stimulation, which would be exhausting and probably expensive. It means that the feeling of time is tied to the texture of experience. A life lived on automatic tends to compress. A life with more conscious noticing tends to expand, at least in memory. Even small changes can alter the internal shape of a week, and once you start seeing that, the next piece of the puzzle comes into view quite naturally. If memory helps explain why time feels large when experience is rich and varied, then routine helps explain why time begins to accelerate when those rich variations decrease. The role of first experiences becomes especially important here, because one of the quietest changes in adult life is that there are simply fewer things the brain can label as genuinely new. There is a quiet change that happens as people move from childhood into adulthood, and it often goes unnoticed until much later. The world stops being made mostly of firsts. You no longer spend your days meeting basic parts of life for the first time. The first day in a classroom, the first sleepover, the first time staying home alone, the first time getting lost, the first time hearing a word you do not understand and deciding it sounds very important anyway. Early life is crowded with these moments. Even small things can carry the energy of discovery because so much of the world is still unfamiliar. But later, something shifts. Life becomes more known, more practiced, more mapped. And when that happens, time often begins to move differently. This matters because novelty appears to play a powerful role in how the brain experiences duration. New experiences tend to make time feel fuller, larger, and in many cases, slower in retrospect. Repeated experiences tend to make time feel more compressed. That does not mean routine is bad, nor that every new experience is automatically good. It means that the brain responds differently to what it already understands than to what it must actively explore. Novelty slows subjective time not because the clock hesitates out of respect, but because the mind has more work to do. Routine speeds time up because the mind becomes efficient. Efficient minds are excellent for functioning. They are less excellent at making months feel spacious. To understand why, it helps to think about how the brain handles information. When you encounter something new, your attention rises. You look more closely. You compare what is happening with what you already know. And when there is no good match, the brain has to build a fresh model. It asks, in effect, what is this? How does it work? Does it matter? Should I remember it? Is it pleasant, dangerous, embarrassing, useful, confusing, or some lively combination of all five? This process requires effort. The unfamiliar thing receives more mental processing. More details are likely to be noticed. More contextual cues are likely to be stored. Later, when you remember the event, it feels large because it left behind a richer trace. Now think about repetition. Once you have done something many times, the brain stops giving it the same level of attention. It recognizes the pattern. It reaches for the existing model. It predicts what will happen next. That is the entire point of learning after all. A brain that treated every toothbrush, staircase, checkout line, and Monday meeting as if it were a cosmic mystery would not be charmingly alive to the world. It would be exhausted. Familiarity lets the brain conserve energy. It says, yes, yes, I know this one, and moves on with less effort. But the side effect is that repeated experiences often receive less detailed encoding. They are handled in broader strokes, they are summarized. This summarizing effect is one of the quiet engines behind the feeling that life speeds up. When fewer experiences stand out as distinct and new, the brain creates fewer memorable markers. Days blend, weeks merge, months become strangely light. A period of life filled with familiar repetitions may still be busy, difficult, productive, meaningful, or even pleasant. But if the experiences do not differ enough to demand separate, vivid encoding, the whole stretch can later feel compressed. The time did not vanish. It was simply stored in a shorthand version. It may help to picture a road. The first time you drive somewhere unfamiliar, the route feels long. You notice every turn, every landmark, every odd building, every place you worry you might be making a mistake. The return journey often feels shorter, even if it takes the same amount of time. The brain has already built a map. It no longer needs to study every feature with the same intensity. Familiarity reduces the mental load, and with reduced mental load often comes a reduced sense of duration. Life contains thousands of versions of this effect. The known path feels shorter than the unknown one. This is one reason travel often seems to expand time. A short trip somewhere new can feel larger in memory than several normal weeks at home. You are navigating unfamiliar streets, hearing different sounds, adjusting to different rhythms, making many small decisions that ordinary life no longer requires. Even things as basic as ordering a meal, reading signs, or finding your way back to where you're staying ask more of your attention. The day becomes thick with distinct moments. You have to notice, and because you notice, more of the day stays with you. Later, it feels as if more time existed there. By contrast, a highly repetitive week can disappear almost indecently fast. Wake up, make coffee, answer messages, work, eat, wash dishes, scroll a little, sleep, repeat. There is nothing wrong with this pattern in itself. It may support an orderly life. It may even contain a good deal of quiet comfort. But the brain is likely to compress it. If Tuesday resembles Monday and Wednesday resembles Tuesday, the memory system begins to group them. It stores a pattern more than a sequence. When you look back, the week may feel like a single unit, rather than 7 distinct lived days. Children experience more novelty, not only because they are younger, but because the world is less catalogued for them. Early life is a long encounter with firsts. First lessons, first fears, first jokes that actually land, first crushes, first humiliations, first summer holidays remembered clearly enough to become family mythology. Even boring things can be novel, because the child has less prior material for comparison. A waiting room may be both dull and strangely interesting if one has not yet spent years learning how to be bored in standardized environments. Novelty is not always thrilling. Sometimes it is awkward, irritating, or tedious, but it is still new and the brain treats it accordingly. Adults often have fewer firsts, especially if life becomes stable for long stretches. The route to work is known, the social roles are known, the general structure of the week is known, the conversation topics are known, even many forms of pleasure become known, which is why adults can say things like, "The holiday was lovely, but it went by in a flash," while the 9-year-old version of them would have experienced the same holiday as something vast enough to require its own internal weather system. The adult brain recognizes patterns rapidly. That recognition is useful, but it shortens the felt size of time. There is a very practical reason novelty leaves stronger traces. The brain evolved to pay attention to change because change can matter. A new sound in the dark, a new face in the group, a new food, a new environment, a new risk. Novelty might signal opportunity or danger. The brain does not know in advance, so it pays attention. In modern life, novelty may be as mild as taking a different route home or trying a class you have never taken before, but the basic pattern remains. The new thing gets more cognitive and emotional resources. The old thing gets processed more efficiently. This difference in processing influences not only memory, but the feeling of aliveness in experience. Novelty often pulls people into the present because prediction is weaker. You cannot glide through the unfamiliar entirely on autopilot. You must orient yourself, You must be there. Routine, by contrast, often permits the mind to drift. You can brush your teeth while thinking about taxes. You can walk through the supermarket while half arguing with someone who is not present and half wondering whether you already bought onions. Familiar tasks free the mind to wander because the body knows the script. This is efficient. It can also make life feel less directly inhabited. That phrase matters. Less directly inhabited. One of the reasons novelty slows time is that it increases presence. You're less able to skip ahead mentally when something requires your active attention. A new city, a difficult recipe, a first date, a first day in a new role, a language you do not yet speak well, a path through unfamiliar woods, even a social situation where you're not sure where to sit. These things tether the mind to the immediate moment. Routine often loosens that tether. You're present enough to function, but not necessarily present enough to encode richly. The minutes pass, the task gets done. The memory footprint is small. This is why people sometimes say that years begin to blur once adulthood settles into a stable pattern. It is not merely that they are older. It is that many parts of life have become highly predictable. The novelty count drops. There are fewer first apartments, fewer first loves, fewer first jobs, fewer first times doing ordinary adult things. Life may become deeper in other ways, certainly. There may be more skill, more loyalty, more knowledge, more subtle pleasures. But from the specific standpoint of time perception, fewer firsts often means fewer strong markers. You can see this even in small examples. Try remembering the first time you ever used a self-checkout machine, or your first day in a job that eventually became normal, or the first night in a house that later became home. Those moments often carry a particular texture. The details cling. Now compare that with your 200th time doing the same thing. The later instance may have been perfectly fine, but unless something unusual happened, it likely merged into the general category of familiar life. Novelty creates edges in memory. Repetition smooths them away. There's another interesting layer here. Novelty can make time feel different in opposite directions, depending on when you ask the question. In the moment, a highly engaging new experience may seem to pass quickly, because attention is absorbed. Later, however, that same period often seems long because it left behind many distinct memories. Routine can do the opposite. A repetitive workday may feel slow while you're living it, especially if you're bored, but later it may seem to have vanished because the memory record is thin. This is one reason time can seem so slippery and contradictory. The brain has more than one way of judging it. Still, when people say time speeds up as they get older, they're often speaking retrospectively. They are looking back at months and years and feeling that they have collapsed. Novelty has a strong effect there because it increases what might be called memory density. More distinct events, more context shifts, more emotional contrasts, more sensory details, more things that do not fit neatly into the usual file. Routine lowers that density. It packages experience into efficient summaries. The summary is useful. It is also compact. One of the reasons school years felt so long in childhood is that they contained a surprising amount of novelty, even when the broad structure looked repetitive. New teachers, changing friendships, bodily changes, social confusion, new expectations, new interests, different skills, fresh embarrassments, occasional triumphs, and the general drama of being a developing person among other developing people. Every year altered the world. A classroom changed, a book got harder, a game changed, a joke became funny for the first time, a song became important for reasons nobody else fully understood. Even a repeated structure like a school term still contained many firsts inside it. Adult routine can be more stable than that. This is not a criticism. Stability supports families, careers, health, and all sorts of sensible things. But stability also means the mind receives fewer signals that say, pay close attention, this is new. Without those signals, life can take on an efficient sameness. You know how to get through the week. You know what happens on Thursdays. You know which cupboard the mugs are in and which forms of nonsense your inbox tends to produce. The brain stops opening fresh files. It updates old ones. This helps explain why major life changes often make time seem to slow down again, or at least thicken. Moving to a new place, beginning a serious relationship, becoming a parent, changing careers, recovering from illness, learning a difficult skill, navigating grief, entering an unfamiliar community, caring for someone, returning to study. These periods often feel enormous because the mind is forced out of summary mode. It must build new maps. It must segment experience more carefully. It must pay attention. Even difficult novelty can produce this effect. Not all expansive time is pleasant, but it is often vividly remembered. There is, however, a misunderstanding people sometimes slip into here. Once they realize novelty expands time, they begin to imagine that the answer is to fill life with constant stimulation. Always travel, always change, always optimize experience, always chase the new. But relentless novelty is not the goal, and in many cases it would simply become another exhausting routine, one in which you are permanently underpacked and mildly stressed. The point is not that novelty is morally better than routine. It is that novelty interrupts compression. It reminds the brain that not all days are the same. Routine, after all, has genuine value. It reduces decision fatigue. It provides safety. It allows habits to support health. It creates reliability in relationships. It helps people do difficult things consistently. Much of what makes a good life possible is repetitive. The issue is not routine itself, but unexamined routine combined with low attention. When life becomes highly patterned and scarcely noticed, time tends to accelerate. When some element of freshness or deliberate noticing returns, time often regains a little texture. This means novelty does not have to be dramatic to matter. It does not require moving to another continent or learning falconry at dawn. It can be small, taking a different route. Reading a type of book you never read. Cooking something unfamiliar. Going somewhere local you have somehow never visited. Speaking to someone you would usually pass by. Learning the names of trees on your street. Listening to music outside your usual habits. Rearranging a room. Walking without a destination for half an hour and letting your attention actually land on things. Small novelties still interrupt autopilot. They still tell the brain, this is not exactly the same. That can be enough to create a more detailed trace. There is also novelty of thought, which matters perhaps more than people expect. You can live in the same place and still encounter new ideas, new questions, new skills, new ways of seeing familiar things. An adult who becomes curious again about ordinary life may start forming richer memories without changing much externally. Novelty is not only external adventure, it is also internal engagement. The world can become somewhat new again if attention becomes less lazy and more alive. This is where routine and novelty meet in an interesting way. A life cannot be all firsts, that is impossible. But a life can be lived with enough variation and enough presence that routine does not flatten everything into one long administrative corridor. The brain needs contrast. It needs occasions to stop saying, same as usual, and start paying proper attention again. Another reason firsts matter is that they often carry stronger emotion. The first day in a new place is charged with uncertainty. The first attempt at something difficult carries hope and awkwardness. The first conversation with someone important contains risk. The first time doing something alone that you used to do with guidance carries independence and a little fear. Emotion makes memory denser, and denser memory makes time seem larger in retrospect. Repeated versions of the same event usually carry less charge. They become normal. Normal is comfortable, but normal does not leave such deep grooves. This helps explain why people sometimes feel nostalgic not just for youth itself, but for the texture of youth. They miss a life in which ordinary events still had first-time energy. They miss the larger emotional weather systems attached to small things. They miss the way one summer could feel like an entire world. What they are often mourning is not merely age, but familiarity. The world became more manageable and in some ways less spacious, yet there is something quietly hopeful here. If part of the speeding up of time comes from fewer firsts and more routine compression, then some of the feeling can be softened not by resisting age, but by resisting total autopilot. One does not need to become a different person. One needs perhaps a few more edges in the week, a few more moments that the brain cannot file under usual, a few more encounters that require genuine attention, because that is really what novelty does. It does not magically add hours, it adds distinctions. It breaks the surface of repeated life and gives memory something to hold on to. It turns a stretch of time from summary back into sequence. It restores a little friction, and friction, though not always comfortable, often makes experience more visible. As people get older, they naturally accumulate knowledge, and knowledge is one of the great causes of compression. You know how this works. You know what comes next. You know the route, the form, the script, the season, the excuse, the ending. But the mind does not only need knowledge, it also needs surprise. Not constant chaos, not endless upheaval, but enough freshness to keep life from becoming too smooth to feel. That is why novelty slows time and routine speeds it up. Novelty asks the brain to wake up, look closely, and build new memory. Routine allows the brain to summarize and conserve effort. Both are useful. But when routine dominates completely, time begins to glide by with alarming efficiency. The years do not shorten, their internal texture does. And once you start to notice that, another piece of the pattern becomes easier to understand. It is not only that adult life contains more routine, it is that routine has a special power to compress whole stretches of living into something that, when recalled later, seems much smaller than it really was. That compression deserves a closer look, because it helps explain why repeated days can quietly turn into vanished years before we fully realize what has happened. There is a particular kind of shock that tends to arrive more often in adult life than in childhood, and it usually sounds something like this. How is it already this time of year again? People say it in shops, in kitchens, in cars, while opening calendars, while noticing weather change, while realizing a birthday is back again with suspicious speed, while taking down decorations that seem to have gone up only yesterday. It is not always a dramatic feeling. Often it is mild, almost casual. But underneath it sits a very real experience. Whole stretches of life begin to feel compressed. Months that were fully lived somehow seem to shrink after the fact. A year that contained work, meals, errands, responsibilities, conversations, worries, plans, small pleasures, tired evenings, ordinary mornings, and many fully occupied days can later feel as though it barely happened at all. Not because nothing occurred, but because repetition has a way of folding experience inward. This is one of the central reasons time seems to speed up as people get older. Repetition compresses memory, and compressed memory makes years feel smaller than they were while they were being lived. The clock continues behaving with perfect indifference. January still contains the same number of days it always did. Tuesday remains stubbornly Tuesday-sized. But the mind does not store every year with equal depth or distinction. When life contains a great deal of repetition, the brain becomes economical. It stops treating each day as a separate event and begins grouping them into patterns. That patterning helps us function, but it also quietly shrinks our sense of time. It helps to be very clear about what repetition does and does not mean. Repetition is not the same as emptiness. A repetitive life can be full of purpose, care, loyalty, labour, and meaning. Much of what keeps households running, relationships stable, children cared for, work completed and health protected depends on repeated acts. Making dinner again, driving the same road again, doing the same job with competence again, washing the same cups, folding the same shirts, answering the same kinds of messages, showing up in the same ways for people who need you. These are not trivial things. In many ways, they are the substance of adult life. But because they recur so often, the brain tends not to store each instance as a richly separate moment. It builds summaries, and summaries are small. That is the key. Repetition does not erase life, it summarizes it. Imagine reading a very long novel in which every page contains mostly the same scene with only minor differences. The details may matter if you're paying very close attention, but when you later try to describe the story, you are likely to group many pages together. You will say, "That was the period where this was happening," rather than recalling each page distinctly. Something similar happens in memory. Repeated routines, repeated locations, repeated tasks, repeated social patterns, repeated stresses, even repeated pleasures can be stored as categories rather than as isolated episodes. The more strongly life falls into familiar loops, the more likely it is that weeks, months, and even years will later appear as broad blocks rather than textured sequences. This is why certain adult periods feel strangely hard to separate in hindsight. Ask someone about 3 consecutive years of a stable work routine, and they may describe them as one general chapter. Ask them about a year involving a move, an illness, a new relationship, a new city, a new baby, a loss, a course of study, or a major change in identity, and they are far more likely to distinguish that year clearly. Repetition smooths edges. Change creates them. The mind is built to notice difference. Difference matters. It may signal risk, opportunity, pleasure, confusion, or the need to adjust behavior. Repetition, by contrast, is treated as known territory. Once the brain determines that a sequence is familiar and manageable, it shifts into a more efficient mode. It stops examining each instance closely, because close examination is no longer necessary. If you have made tea 10,000 times, there is no reason for the brain to treat each cup as an event requiring elaborate encoding, unless something unusual happens, such as the kettle singing opera or a pigeon somehow entering the ritual with opinions. This efficiency is useful. Without it, daily life would be exhausting. But the cost of efficiency is compression. The more the brain relies on established templates, the fewer fresh markers it creates. A day full of familiar actions becomes one more example of a known pattern. A week becomes a repetition of the same pattern. A month becomes a larger repetition still. When you later ask where that time went, the answer is hidden in the mechanism that made the days easier to survive. The time was folded into pattern memory. There is an important distinction here between living through repetition and remembering it later. Repetitive time does not always feel fast in the moment. In fact, repetition mixed with boredom can make the immediate experience of time feel painfully slow. A dull afternoon at work can drag. A repetitive task can feel endless while you're doing it. Waiting in a line, answering the same kind of query for the 20th time, sitting through a meeting that should have been a paragraph, all of these can make minutes feel swollen and uncooperative. But afterward, those same hours may be remembered very thinly. So repetition can produce the odd combination of slow days and fast years. This is one of the strangest features of subjective time. Individual moments can drag while the larger stretches they belong to collapse. Many adults know this feeling well. The work week can feel long while it is happening, especially if stress and obligation are high, yet the months built from those weeks often feel alarmingly short. It is suddenly autumn, then suddenly New Year, then suddenly spring again, and you are left with the uneasy sense that life has been moving quickly, despite many slow Tuesdays. Repetition helps explain this. The brain is not primarily asking, "Did this feel long at 2:43 p.m. on a Thursday?" It is asking, when looking back, "How much distinct material do I have from this stretch?" If the answer is not much beyond the general pattern, the stretch feels compressed. Think of laundry. While doing it, the process can feel as though it has a personal grudge against the human species. Sorting, washing, drying, folding, putting away, discovering a sock has again chosen a solitary life. None of this feels instant in the moment, yet 6 months of laundry will not usually appear in memory as a grand saga. it will be compressed into the broad category of ordinary life maintenance. Many adult tasks share this quality. They take real time, real energy, and often a surprising amount of patience, but they do not leave behind many distinct memory markers. As a result, they occupy much less retrospective time than they occupied actual time. This is why years of responsibility can feel thin in retrospect, even when they were packed with effort. Effort is not enough by itself to expand time in memory. Distinction matters, contrast matters, segmentation matters. The brain needs events that stand apart from one another. If every week is labour-intensive but similar, the memory system groups rather than separates. Much is lived, little is individuated. Repetition also affects attention, and attention shapes memory. Familiar tasks often require less direct awareness. You can perform them while thinking about something else, worrying about tomorrow, replaying a conversation, or mentally constructing a reply you will never actually send. This divided attention makes encoding lighter. The body may be present, but the mind is only partially invested in what is happening. And memory cannot become rich from what attention barely noticed. The repeated and half-registered parts of life are especially vulnerable to compression. This is one reason adulthood can feel less spacious than childhood. It is not only that there are more routines, it is also that adults often spend much of routine time thinking beyond the moment. Children, even when bored, are often more immersed in the immediate conditions of life. Adults may wash dishes while planning the week, drive while worrying about an unpaid bill, walk while drafting emails in their minds, sit through dinner while thinking about tomorrow morning. Again, this is understandable. Responsibility invites mental time travel. But it also reduces the texture of the present. A thinly inhabited present leaves a thin memory trace. There is also the issue of environmental sameness. Repetition is not just about tasks, it is also about setting. Seeing the same rooms, same roads, same shop interiors, same office corridors, same digital interfaces, same sequence of familiar spaces day after day encourages the brain to stop updating the map in detail. You know the route, you know the wall colour, you know the arrangement of chairs and the smell of the lift and the angle of late afternoon sun through that same window. Once these are deeply familiar, they recede. The brain no longer spends much effort on them unless something changes. A changed environment, by contrast, forces renewed attention. This is one reason even short breaks in place can make time feel more substantial. People often return from a brief trip saying it felt longer than it was. In literal terms, it was not longer, of course, though airports have a remarkable talent for challenging that statement. What they usually mean is that the trip contained more noticeable life per unit of clock time. Different streets, different foods, different patterns of movement, different expectations. The brain was denied its normal shortcuts. It had to work harder and therefore stored more. By comparison, a month in a highly repetitive environment may feel smaller because the mind could move through it efficiently. Efficiency deserves a little suspicion here, because it is so often praised and so rarely questioned. Efficiency is useful for getting things done, but a fully efficient life may become experientially narrow. When every process is smoothed, automated, repeated, optimized, and fitted into reliable grooves, the brain has little reason to wake up and say, "This one is different." It saves effort. It also saves less of life. The result can be a strange mismatch between function and feeling. You are managing well, perhaps. Things are being handled. But time is vanishing. This helps explain why people can feel a vague grief in stable periods of life, even when nothing is outwardly wrong. They are not necessarily unhappy. They may be grateful for the steadiness. Yet they sense that life is moving quickly. A year passes, then another, and both seem strangely light in retrospect. What they are grieving may not be drama or youth or intensity, but texture. Repetition has reduced texture. The years are being stored in broad strokes. One way to see this clearly is to think about the difference between a densely segmented year and a loosely segmented one. A densely segmented year contains clear turning points, new beginnings, endings, trips, conversations that mattered, visible changes in place or role, emotional peaks, disruptions in pattern, periods that can be named. A loosely segmented year contains many days that resemble one another with only modest variation. It may still contain real work and real care, but it is harder to divide into memorable sections. When you look back, one year feels long and eventful. The other feels short and vague. Repetition is often the deciding factor. There is a physical metaphor here that helps. Imagine pouring sand into a container and then tapping the sides. The grains settle more tightly. The volume reduces without any material being lost. Repetition does something similar to time in memory. The lived experiences are still there, but they settle into a more compact arrangement. Less space is taken up in recall, less perceived duration remains. This is why repeated celebrations can start to feel as though they are arriving faster. The first few of something are usually distinct. The first birthday celebrated in a new place. The first holiday spent with a new partner. The first family gathering with children old enough to understand what is happening. But later, if many celebrations follow a very similar pattern, the brain groups them. Christmases at the house, summers at the lake, birthdays at the restaurant. There may be genuine joy in these repetitions, and traditions often matter precisely because they repeat. But repetition still compresses. Unless something stands out sharply, whole sequences may later merge into a single memory category. One reason people are startled by how quickly years pass is that seasonal landmarks stop creating as much separation as they once did. Repetition also works through expectation. When you know what comes next, time is mentally easier to traverse. Predictability lowers uncertainty. Lower uncertainty lowers attention. Lower attention reduces encoding. The familiar sequence requires less presence and therefore leaves less of a footprint. Adults often live in environments built around expectation. There is a calendar, a schedule, a plan, a workflow, a route. Childhood, by contrast, often includes more waiting without understanding, more partial knowledge, more altered routines, more dependence on others' decisions, and therefore more experiential suspense. Suspense stretches time. Predictability compresses it. Even conversations can become compressed when repeated patterns dominate. Not because repeated conversations are unimportant, but because the brain notices when the general shape is known. The weekly check-in, the familiar joke, the same family topics, the same workplace issues. Human relationships are built partly from repetition, and that repetition can be comforting. But from the perspective of subjective time, familiar interaction patterns do not always create large memory divisions unless something new occurs inside them. The same is true of personal identity. Repetition in role can compress time as well. If you spend years inhabiting one clear role with relatively stable routines, the mind begins to store experience under that role. Those were the years when I was doing that job. Those were the years when the children were small. Those were the years when life revolved around commuting. Role identity is useful for organizing memory, but it can flatten internal detail. A chapter in life may span many years and later feel shorter than it was because it has been grouped under one title. This does not mean repetition should be feared or avoided at all costs. Human beings need rhythm. We need habits. We need predictable structures to support sleep, eating, work, care, and emotional stability. A life without repetition would be chaos, and chaos is not a reliable path to meaningful time. Still, repetition becomes compressive when it is both strong and unattended. The combination matters. A repeated life that is deeply noticed may not shrink as severely as a repeated life lived mostly on autopilot. That distinction is important because it introduces a quiet possibility. If repetition shrinks our sense of time through summarization, then perhaps one way of resisting compression is not to eliminate repetition, which would be absurd, but to increase distinction within it. Small distinctions. Not theatrical reinventions of the self every fortnight, which sounds tiring and difficult to schedule, but slight shifts that create memorable edges. A repeated walk taken with closer attention, A weekly meal altered enough to be noticed. A day structured differently. A conversation that breaks the script. A new place entered, even nearby. A ritual performed with awareness instead of haste. Repetition does not have to become invisible. It becomes invisible when the brain sees no reason to register it freshly. This is where the problem of compression becomes strangely hopeful. The years feel small partly because experience is bundled, not because experience is gone. There are ways to create more mental separation, more texture, more markers, even inside a stable life. It does not require turning existence into a travel brochure or a personal challenge series. It requires some interruption of sameness and some recovery of attention. Still, before getting to how that might work, it is worth dwelling a little longer on the sheer force of compression, because it explains a great many adult sensations, why one's 20s or 30s or 40s can begin to look from a distance like a single sweep, why routines that once seemed temporary become invisible background for years, why people are startled by photographs proving that events they feel were recent are in fact from 6 years ago, why parents, workers, caregivers, and anyone living inside recurring obligations often feel that time is flying, even when they rarely feel especially carefree. Compression is powerful because it does not require idleness. It happens just as easily in busy lives. In fact, busyness without variation may be one of the strongest conditions for compression. When a person is constantly occupied, but mostly by recurring tasks, there is little spare attention for rich encoding. Everything gets handled in sequence. Days are full, but not distinct. At the end of the month, there may be a great deal of fatigue and surprisingly little clear memory. This can create a painful impression that life is being consumed by administration, not because administration is worthless, but because the memory of it is so compact. You gave your time to many things, and memory returns only a thin receipt. There is another subtle consequence of repetition. Because familiar stretches of life compress in memory, unusual periods can appear larger by comparison. A brief illness, a move, a trip, a week of crisis, a new romance, a short course of study, even a single emotionally charged conversation can occupy more retrospective space than months of ordinary life around it. This can distort how people evaluate their own histories. They may remember the disruptions more clearly than the ordinary years that sustained everything. But the ordinary years were not empty. They were simply compressed. And once that is understood, the next question almost asks itself, if repetition shrinks our sense of time by smoothing differences and encouraging summary, then what exactly allows some moments to resist this shrinking? What gives certain days, even ordinary ones, a larger internal size? Part of the answer lies in attention itself, because repetition is not the whole story. Two people can live through similar routines and feel time differently depending on how much of life they actually notice while it is happening. There is something quietly powerful about attention, something so ordinary that it often goes unnoticed, and yet it shapes the very texture of time as we experience it. Two people can live through the same hour and come away with entirely different impressions of how long it felt, how much happened, and how clearly it remains in memory. The difference is often not in the events themselves, but in how much of those events were actually attended to. Attention does not change the clock, but it changes the experience of the clock so thoroughly that it can feel as though time itself has shifted. To understand this, it helps to notice something simple. When you're paying very close attention to something, time can seem to slow down. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a quieter, more practical sense. You notice more details. You become aware of small changes. You're present for each part of the experience rather than skipping ahead. The moment feels fuller because more of it is being processed. By contrast, when your attention is scattered or drifting, time often seems to pass quickly. You move through events without registering them clearly, and when you look back it feels as though very little time was there at all. This is not because time behaves differently in those situations. it is because your brain is building a different record. Attention determines what becomes part of that record, and the richness of that record is one of the main ways the brain later judges how much time has passed. Consider something as simple as waiting. Waiting is one of the clearest demonstrations of attention shaping time. When you are waiting for something and focusing on the fact that you are waiting, every minute seems to expand. You check the time, you estimate how long it has been, you become aware of each passing second. The mind is, in a sense, tracking time directly, and because it is tracking time, it feels longer. Waiting rooms, loading screens, slow elevators, and delayed trains all benefit from this effect in ways nobody has ever enjoyed. Now compare that with a situation where your attention is fully absorbed. You're engaged in a conversation, solving a problem, reading something interesting, cooking something that requires care, or working on something that holds your interest just enough to keep you involved without overwhelming you. In those moments, time often seems to pass quickly, not because it is shortened, but because your attention is not monitoring it. The brain is busy processing the task, and the internal sense of duration fades into the background. When you later look at the clock, you may be surprised by how much time has passed. This contrast between waiting and absorption is familiar to most people, but it becomes more interesting when you connect it to aging and the sense that time speeds up. One of the quiet changes in adult life is not only that there is more routine, but that attention is often divided. Adults rarely have the luxury of giving their full attention to a single moment for extended periods. There are always other things pulling at the mind. Responsibilities, plans, worries, reminders, unfinished tasks, messages waiting to be answered, things that need to be remembered later. Even during ordinary activities, part of the mind is often elsewhere. This divided attention has a particular effect on time perception. When attention is split, fewer details are fully processed. You may complete tasks efficiently, but you're not deeply registering them. The brain receives a thinner stream of information. Later, when reconstructing that period, it finds fewer distinct elements to work with. The result is a compressed sense of time. The hour was real, but it was not richly attended, and so it feels smaller. This is one reason a day filled with distraction can seem to disappear. You may have been busy from morning to evening, moving from one task to another, responding, organising, managing, and yet at the end of the day it can feel as though it barely happened. Not because nothing occurred, but because attention was never fully settled on any one thing. The day was lived in fragments. Fragments are harder to remember. Harder to remember means less perceived time. Children, by contrast, often display a different pattern of attention. Their attention can be inconsistent, certainly, but when they are engaged, they are often fully engaged. A child building something, playing a game, watching something that captures their interest, or even staring at something they find puzzling, can become deeply absorbed. In those moments, they are not dividing their attention across multiple responsibilities. They are in the experience. This kind of attention increases the richness of perception. It creates more detailed memory. It makes time feel fuller. There is also the opposite effect in childhood, which is equally important. When children are bored, they often become very aware of time. Without a task to absorb attention, the mind turns toward the passage of time itself. Minutes stretch. The afternoon feels long. This combination of deep absorption and heightened awareness during boredom creates a varied experience of time. Some moments feel quick, others feel slow, but many are strongly felt. Strongly felt moments tend to leave clearer traces in memory. In adult life, boredom is often interrupted quickly. There are many tools available to fill empty space: a phone, a screen, a task, a habit, a distraction. This reduces the duration of pure waiting, which might seem like an improvement, and in many ways it is. But it also means that the sharp contrast between slow and fast moments becomes less pronounced. Time becomes smoother, and smooth time is often easier to compress. Another important aspect of attention is its relationship with awareness. Attention determines what you focus on, but awareness determines how fully you experience that focus. It is possible to perform a task with attention directed toward it, but without much awareness. This is what happens when you operate on autopilot. You're technically paying attention in the sense that you're doing the task correctly, but you're not consciously noticing much about it. The experience passes through you with minimal registration. Driving a familiar route is a good example. You can navigate the entire journey safely and competently, and yet remember almost nothing about it afterward. You are attentive enough to function, but not aware enough to encode the experience richly. The journey becomes a blank in memory, and because it becomes a blank, it contributes almost nothing to your sense of lived time. This effect is widespread in adult life. Many daily activities are performed in this semi-automatic state. Preparing meals, commuting, routine work tasks, household chores, even conversations that follow familiar patterns. The brain has learned how to handle these situations efficiently, and so it reduces the need for conscious awareness. This is practical, but it also means that large portions of life are experienced in a low-resolution mode. Low-resolution experience leads to low-resolution memory. Low-resolution memory leads to compressed time. The connection is direct. There is also the question of where attention is directed when it is not focused on the present. Much of adult thinking involves time travel of a different kind. Not physical movement through time, but mental movement. You think about the past, replaying events, analysing conversations, reconsidering decisions. You think about the future, planning, worrying, anticipating, preparing. This mental time travel is useful. It helps you learn, prepare, and navigate complex situations. But it also pulls attention away from the present moment. When attention is repeatedly drawn into the past and future, the present becomes thinner. You are physically present, but mentally elsewhere. The brain processes less of what is happening now, and because it processes less, it stores less. The day becomes a series of partially attended moments. Later, when you try to recall it, there is not much to retrieve. The day feels short. This is not a moral failing. It is a natural consequence of a brain that has learned to manage complex responsibilities. But it does have an effect on how time is experienced. A mind that spends much of its time outside the present moment may feel that time is slipping away, because in a sense, much of it was never fully inhabited. This is where awareness becomes important. Awareness is not about forcing yourself to pay attention to everything all the time, which would be exhausting and unrealistic. It is about allowing some moments to be fully experienced rather than automatically passed through. It is about noticing what is actually happening, even briefly. The sound of something, the texture of something, the rhythm of a task, the presence of another person, the small details that are usually ignored. When awareness increases even slightly, the richness of experience increases. When richness increases, memory becomes more detailed. When memory becomes more detailed, time feels larger in retrospect. The same hour can feel different depending on how much of it was actually noticed. This does not mean that every moment needs to be turned into a profound experience. It means that some moments can be allowed to exist fully rather than being treated as transitions to the next thing. A meal can be tasted rather than simply consumed. A walk can be seen rather than simply completed. A conversation can be heard rather than simply responded to. These are small shifts, but they accumulate. There is also a relationship between attention and emotional state. When you are stressed, attention tends to narrow. The brain focuses on what seems urgent or threatening. This can be useful in short bursts, but when stress is constant, it reduces the range of attention. You notice less of the environment, less of the experience, and more of the problem you are trying to manage. This can lead to a sense that time is both dragging in the moment and disappearing in memory. The present feels heavy, but later it feels thin. When you are calm or engaged, attention can widen. You notice more, you take in more detail, you process more of the environment. This increases the density of experience. It makes time feel fuller. This is one reason why relaxed, attentive states are often associated with a richer sense of time. Not slower in a strict sense, but more complete. There is a concept often discussed in psychology known as flow. It describes a state where attention is fully absorbed in a task that is neither too easy nor too difficult. In this state, people often report losing track of time. Hours can pass quickly, yet when they look back on the experience, it often feels substantial and satisfying. This is because attention was deeply engaged. The brain was processing continuously, building a rich record even though it was not monitoring time directly. Flow is not always easy to achieve, and it is not necessary for every moment of life. But it illustrates an important point. When attention is fully engaged, time can feel both quick in the moment and large in memory. The quality of attention determines both experiences. In contrast, when attention is shallow or fragmented, time can feel both slow in the moment and small in memory. A distracted hour can feel tedious while it is happening and insignificant afterward. This is one of the less pleasant combinations. It creates the impression of time being both difficult and fleeting. Another aspect of attention worth considering is intentionality. When you choose to focus on something, rather than being pulled into it by habit or obligation, the experience often becomes more vivid. Intentional attention carries a different quality. It is not just directed, it is invested. This investment can increase the salience of the experience. It becomes more likely to be remembered, and therefore more likely to contribute to a larger sense of time. This is why even simple, intentional activities can feel more substantial than more complex, automatic ones. Sitting quietly and paying attention to something ordinary can leave a stronger impression than rushing through multiple tasks without awareness. The difference lies not in the complexity of the activity, but in the quality of attention given to it. As people get older, it is not only that novelty decreases and routine increases, it is also that attention becomes more distributed across many concerns. The mind becomes busy in a different way. It is less often fully absorbed in the present, and more often balancing multiple threads of thought. This reduces the density of experience. Reduced density leads to compressed time. The interesting thing about this is that it suggests a way of understanding the feeling that time is speeding up without treating it as an inevitable decline. If part of the effect comes from how attention is used, then changes in attention can influence the experience of time, not completely and not magically, but meaningfully. Paying attention does not slow the clock, it slows the loss of detail. It increases the amount of life that is actually experienced rather than simply passed through. It creates more material for memory, and memory is one of the ways the brain decides how much time has been lived. This does not require dramatic changes. It can begin with noticing small things. The shape of a room, the tone of a voice, the feeling of walking, the taste of food, the pattern of light at a certain time of day. These details are always present but often ignored. When they are noticed, even briefly, they become part of the experience. They add texture. Texture is what gives time its sense of size. A textured day feels different from a smooth one. A textured week leaves more behind than a uniform one. A textured year resists compression more than a repetitive one. So when time seems to speed up, it is worth asking not only how much is happening, but how much is being noticed. The answer is rarely zero, of course. People do notice things, but the balance between automatic processing and conscious awareness shifts over time, and that shift influences how life is experienced. Attention does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be present often enough to give experience some edges. Those edges are what the brain uses to build a sense of duration. Without them, time becomes smooth and fast. With them, it becomes more varied, more detailed, and more resistant to disappearing unnoticed. And once attention enters the picture, another layer becomes visible. Because attention does not operate in isolation, It is influenced by emotion. What you feel changes what you notice. What you notice changes what you remember, and what you remember changes how long time seems to have been. Emotion does not merely colour our experience of time, it changes its shape. A day is never just a day in the mind. It is a day felt through mood, stress, hope, irritation, relief, excitement, grief, calm, dread, pleasure, boredom, and all the smaller shades in between. The clock may continue in its quiet mechanical way, never dramatic, never sentimental, never impressed by your plans, but human experience does not move with that kind of neutrality. We do not live inside time as detached observers. We live inside it as feeling creatures. And because of that, emotion has a remarkable ability to stretch some moments, shrink others, and leave memory with an impression that can be very different from the objective length of what happened. This becomes especially important when asking why time seems to speed up as we get older. Emotion helps explain part of the answer, because emotional life changes over time. Not necessarily in the sense that adults feel less than children, though sometimes people talk as if that were true. Adults often feel just as much, and sometimes more, but the structure of emotional experience changes. The kinds of feelings that dominate daily life may become more repetitive, more managed, more backgrounded, or more tied to ongoing responsibilities than to sudden first-time events. Childhood and youth often contain stronger emotional contrasts tied to novelty. Adulthood often contains more sustained emotional patterns tied to routine, stress, and expectation. That difference matters because the brain does not treat all emotional states equally when building the feeling of time. Let us begin with something many people know instinctively. Joy often seems to make time pass quickly. An enjoyable evening can vanish almost indecently fast. A meal with people you like, a long conversation, a holiday afternoon, a game, music, laughter, a day spent doing something that genuinely absorbs you. These experiences can seem to pass before you have properly settled into them. You look at the clock and feel that some private agreement has been violated. Surely not already. Surely it has not been 3 hours. Surely the universe is not allowed to do this to a pleasant Saturday. This happens in part because attention during joyful or engaging moments is not focused on time itself. The mind is occupied. It is immersed in what is happening. You're not measuring the passing minutes, you're living them. Time recedes into the background because your cognitive and emotional resources are involved elsewhere. The result is that the immediate experience often feels fast. The hour flies because it is not being watched. But joy has another effect that complicates the picture. Although joyful time may feel quick in the moment, it can feel larger afterward if it was emotionally rich and distinctive enough to leave strong memories. A happy trip, a celebration, an evening that mattered, a period of life filled with affection or discovery. These things may seem brief while happening and expansive when recalled. The brain stores emotionally meaningful experiences with more depth than emotionally flat ones. So joy can produce the curious combination of fast moments and large memories. This is one reason certain good periods of life can seem both short and full. They disappear while you're living them and then remain vivid afterward. Emotion does not just speed or slow time in a single simple way. It affects how time feels in the moment and how it is reconstructed later. Stress behaves differently. Stress often creates a strange double effect. In the moment, stress can make time feel heavy, crowded, or distorted. A stressful afternoon can drag because each task is felt as effortful, each interruption as costly, each delay as irritating, each obligation as one more thing pressing against limited attention. When stress is acute, the mind may become narrowly focused on problems, deadlines, or threats. This narrow focus can increase awareness of duration in certain contexts, especially when one is waiting for something difficult to end. A tense meeting, a painful conversation, an exam, a medical appointment, a traffic jam when already late, all can create the feeling that time is moving badly. Not exactly slowly in a peaceful way, but slowly in a sticky, resistant way. And yet, when stressful periods become routine, they can shrink dramatically in retrospect. This is because chronic stress often reduces the richness of attention. Instead of noticing the full texture of life, the brain concentrates on what seems urgent. The field of awareness narrows. Details not relevant to the perceived stressor are often ignored. You move through the day, scanning for problems, managing responsibilities, bracing for the next demand. This can make days feel long and unpleasant while they are happening, but surprisingly thin once they're over. Entire stressful months can collapse in memory because what remains is a general tone of strain, rather than many distinct retrievable moments. This is one reason people can look back on a very stressful year and say both that was exhausting and it went by in a blur. The blur does not mean the experience was light or unimportant. It means the memory system recorded it under conditions of narrowed attention, repeated strain, and high routine pressure. Much was felt, but not everything was distinctly stored. Stress tends to prioritize survival and function over rich, balanced encoding. That is useful in crisis. It is less helpful for preserving a spacious sense of time. Fear provides another version of emotional distortion. People often report that frightening moments seem to slow down. A fall, a near accident, a sudden shock, a moment of danger. These events can feel elongated, as though time itself has stretched to accommodate the intensity of what is happening. There are a few reasons for this. One is that fear heightens attention dramatically. The brain becomes extremely alert to details that might matter. Perception sharpens. The world can seem clearer, more precise, more immediate. Another reason is that fear often leads to denser memory formation. Later, when the event is recalled, the rich detail makes it seem as though more time must have passed because so much is present in memory. This is important, because the feeling of slowed time during fear may be partly a reconstruction, rather than a literal slowing of experience in the moment. The brain stores so much so quickly that, in retrospect, the event appears elongated. Whether the moment actually felt slower while occurring or merely seemed slower afterward can vary. But either way, fear produces expansion. It gives moments weight and detail. Children often live with emotional states that are more immediate, less regulated, and more tightly tied to first-time experiences. Excitement before a birthday can make a week feel endless. Embarrassment at school can make a morning feel unlivable. Joy in a game can make hours vanish. Fear of the dark can make bedtime contain entire geographies of imagined risk. Because emotion in childhood is often large, direct, and closely linked to novelty, it stretches and shapes time strongly. A child's world is not only full of first experiences, it is full of feelings attached to those first experiences, and those feelings make the days feel larger. Adults are not emotionless, of course, but adult emotional life often becomes more repetitive in form. There may be fewer dramatic firsts and more recurring emotional patterns, ongoing worry about work, background stress about money, familiar frustration, manageable but constant fatigue, repeated low-grade pressure. These emotional states influence time too, but they do not always create strong markers. Repetitive emotions can flatten experience just as repetitive tasks do. If every week carries the same moderate stress, the brain may begin summarizing not only the schedule but also the feeling of the schedule. One month of it blends into the next. Emotional repetition becomes another kind of compression. This helps explain something people often struggle to name. A year may have felt emotionally difficult, but when they look back it seems both long in suffering and short in memory. The long part belonged to the lived burden of stress. The short part belongs to the brain's tendency to compress repeated emotional conditions into a general impression. That was a hard time. True, but not very segmented. Much of what made it hard may no longer stand apart clearly, because the emotional tone was continuous. Joy, by contrast, is often less repetitive in structure, especially when it arises from novelty, connection, or meaningful breaks from routine. A joyful event can become a marker, so can grief, awe, relief, or love. Emotions that create contrast tend to leave stronger separations in memory. And separation matters. Separation gives time shape. There is also the matter of anticipation. Anticipation is one of emotion's most effective tools for altering time. Waiting for something wanted can stretch the days before it. Holidays, reunions, trips, messages, test results, important conversations. The future event occupies attention before it arrives, making the present feel elongated in relation to it. Children often live more vividly inside anticipation because their ability to regulate and contextualize future time is still developing. Waiting for something wonderful can feel almost unbearable. Adulthood does not remove anticipation, but it often surrounds it with more distractions and obligations. A child may live entirely in the wait. An adult often waits while also answering emails. Dread is anticipation's darker cousin, and it also stretches time. Waiting for an unpleasant event can make hours drag. The mind rehearses, predicts, braces, and imagines. This pulls attention toward the future, while simultaneously making the present feel heavy. The event itself may later seem brief, but the dread before it can expand enormously. Emotion also shapes what attention selects. We do not notice the world evenly. We notice what matters to how we feel. A joyful person may attend to warmth, faces, possibility, playfulness, beauty, or amusement. A stressed person may attend to deadlines, noise, interruptions, mistakes, and signs of trouble. An anxious person may scan for uncertainty. A grieving person may notice absence everywhere. Because attention determines memory and emotion directs attention, emotion indirectly shapes how much time seems to have been lived. Different feelings produce different records. This is why two people can live through the same external event and remember it with very different senses of duration. One may have felt relaxed and engaged, the other self-conscious and tense. One may remember many pleasant details, the other mostly the long wait before speaking. The clock offered the same interval. Emotion determined the internal landscape. There is another subtle way emotion alters time, and that is through intensity versus monotony. Intense emotions, whether pleasant or unpleasant, often make moments stand out. Monotonous emotional states often make longer stretches disappear into summary. This means that a life filled only with moderate repeated emotional tones can begin to feel strangely compressed, not because nothing mattered, but because few emotional states stood apart sharply enough to divide the stream. This is part of why periods of falling in love, grieving, moving, beginning something, ending something, recovering or changing deeply, often seem longer than periods of stable routine. Strong emotion creates landmarks. It says to memory, this belongs in its own place. Even if the period itself was not long by the calendar, it often becomes large in recollection because the emotions were too distinct to be merged smoothly with everything around them. One might think, then, that stronger emotions are always good for time perception, because they make life feel fuller. But it is not so simple. Intensity can enrich memory, yes, but it can also overwhelm. Trauma, for example, can produce highly unusual patterns of time perception and memory. Some moments may feel frozen, repeated, fragmented, or disconnected. Some periods may be remembered in sharp fragments, and others not at all. The relationship between emotion and time under traumatic conditions is not merely a stronger version of ordinary memory density. It is more complicated and often painful. So when talking about emotion stretching time, it is important to remember that not all expansion is welcome. A life does not become better simply because it becomes more intense. What seems to matter most for an ordinary healthy sense of fuller time is not constant emotional drama, but emotional presence combined with variation and awareness. A life with some joy, some surprise, some connection, some tenderness, some curiosity, some meaningful challenge, some relief, some sadness honestly felt rather than constantly suppressed, will usually produce a more textured sense of time than a life dominated by flat repetition or chronic strain. The aim is not to maximize emotion like some deranged laboratory exercise. It is to understand that feeling helps carve time into lived forms. As people age, one reason time may seem faster is that emotional life often becomes both more managed and more familiar. You know certain feelings already. You know how stress behaves in your body. You know the texture of a Monday mood. You know the low-level worry of responsibilities. You know the forms of disappointment and relief that come with ordinary adult life. This familiarity is useful, but it reduces contrast. A familiar feeling does not automatically receive the same vivid storage as an unfamiliar one. Just as the brain compresses repeated tasks, it may compress repeated moods. There is a phrase people sometimes use, the years blur. Emotion is one of the substances inside that blur. When emotional tones become repetitive and linked to routine, the blur thickens. When emotional contrast returns, the blur breaks apart. A single evening of genuine delight may stand out against a month of ordinary strain. A difficult conversation may divide a season into before and after. A period of calm after stress may feel strangely spacious because the emotional shift itself becomes a landmark. Another factor is emotional regulation. Adults are often better than children at managing feeling, which is broadly a good thing. It prevents all sorts of social disasters, regrettable texts and public scenes involving cake. But regulation can also make emotion less visible in experience. Feelings are controlled, moderated, translated into practical action. This may reduce the strong temporal distortions that come with more immediate emotion. Children feel and time stretches. Adults manage and continue. That continuity supports functioning, but functioning can be temporally compact. There is also the relationship between emotion and memory retrieval. Emotional memories are often easier to access. They come back more readily, with more sensory and narrative detail. Because they are easy to retrieve, they occupy more retrospective space. Neutral periods of life can be meaningful yet difficult to summon clearly. If a year contained mostly moderate routine and low emotional contrast, it may feel small not because it was empty, but because little in it is easily retrievable. The mind returns to what was emotionally charged. This can create a skewed sense of one's own life. The emotionally vivid parts seem large, the ordinary parts seem small, and yet much of a meaningful life consists of ordinary parts. This is worth noticing because it can otherwise lead to unfair conclusions. A person may feel that time is racing because only the exceptional or difficult moments stand out, while the repeated acts of care, work, loyalty and presence have compressed. But compressed does not mean unimportant. It simply means the memory system is not a fair historian. Still, if emotion helps create the landmarks that resist compression, then one gentle implication is that living with some openness to feeling may help life retain texture. Not melodrama, not self-manufactured crisis, not treating every coffee as a spiritual event, but actual contact with what is felt. Enjoying something fully, noticing affection when it is there, letting relief be relief, letting grief be grief, letting curiosity wake up, feeling awe occasionally without immediately trying to post about it or explain it to death. Emotion, when honestly inhabited, gives memory shape. Shape gives time dimension. This also suggests that a chronically numbed life may speed up in a particularly harsh way. If one moves through years slightly detached, slightly overloaded, slightly defended against feeling because there is simply too much to handle, then time can become alarmingly thin. The days get done, but they do not thicken. Emotion is not only part of what makes life difficult, it is part of what makes it perceivable. So when asking how joy, stress and fear stretch or shrink time, the answer is that they do so by directing attention, altering memory density, changing the texture of the present, and creating or erasing contrast. Joy often makes moments fly yet leaves warm, rich traces. Stress can make hours drag and months vanish. Fear can intensify experience so sharply that a few seconds seem enormous. Repetitive emotional states compress. Distinct emotional events expand. And because emotional life changes with age, so too does the internal shape of time. All of this brings us toward another important piece of the puzzle. Emotion helps determine what becomes vivid and what fades, but it does not work alone. The brain is also sorting experience behind the scenes, deciding what to keep in detail and what to file away more roughly. That internal sorting system matters a great deal, because as life fills with more repeated patterns and more accumulated experience, the brain becomes increasingly selective about what it stores clearly and what it lets blend into the background. The brain is not a library in the neat and flattering way people sometimes imagine. It is not a grand hall filled with perfectly arranged shelves where every moment waits patiently to be retrieved in full detail whenever called upon. It is far more practical than that, and far less sentimental. The brain is busy. It is selective. It is economical. It is trying to help you function, not preserve an exact museum of everything you've ever lived through. And because of that, memory is not stored with equal care across the whole of life. Some things are filed in sharp detail, some are stored as broad summaries, some are lightly sketched and then quietly thinned over time. This filing system is one of the major reasons years begin to feel compressed as people get older. The mind becomes increasingly good at deciding what does not need to be kept in full resolution. To understand why, it helps to begin with a simple fact. The brain is constantly receiving more information than it could ever possibly preserve in detail. Every room has textures, sounds, positions, temperatures, smells, facial expressions, small movements, words half heard, objects barely glanced at, internal thoughts, bodily sensations, emotional tones, and dozens of tiny changes every minute. Most of this cannot be stored with equal weight. If it were, consciousness would become a sort of endless hoarding situation, and the simplest afternoon would be impossible to manage. So the brain filters, it selects, it compresses, it keeps what seems useful, meaningful, novel, emotional, or relevant to ongoing patterns, and it lets much else fade into broader categories. This is not a failure. It is one of the reasons human thought works at all. Still, the side effect is that life becomes less detailed in memory over time, especially when experience is repetitive. If a certain kind of day happens again and again, the brain stops preserving each version separately. It does not need to. It already has the general model. Once a pattern is learned, new instances are often filed under the existing category, with only the differences highlighted. If nothing stands out strongly enough, the day may be stored only as another example of the usual kind. This is the brain's filing system at work. It does not ask, was this technically part of your life? It asks something closer to, did this contain information I need to distinguish from what I already know? If the answer is mostly no, then much of the detail is not preserved. Imagine you begin a new job. The first week is often vividly remembered. The layout of the building, the names you're trying not to forget, the uncertainty of where to stand, the strange ritual of pretending to understand systems that still feel completely imaginary, the first lunch, the first mistake, the first successful moment. The brain records quite a lot because everything is new. There is no existing folder thick enough to hold it comfortably. Now imagine your 100th ordinary week in the same job under similar conditions. You still live it, certainly. You may still care about it. But unless something unusual happens, the brain already knows where to file the experience. It gets summarized. You're not remembering the 100th week in high detail because most of its structure has already been represented in memory many times before. This is why earlier periods of life often seem richer in memory than later ones. Childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, these stages contain many foundational firsts and many unstable patterns. The brain is building categories rapidly. It does not yet know what kind of world this is, what sort of people are in it, what kinds of places matter, what sorts of relationships will exist, or how daily life is generally structured. So it stores a great deal, often with texture and vividness. Later, once categories are more established, the brain becomes more economical. It can say, in effect, "Ah yes, another version of that," and file the experience more lightly. The hippocampus plays an important role here. It is one of the brain regions deeply involved in forming and organizing new memories, especially episodic memories, the memories of particular events in context. It helps bind together the pieces of experience, where something happened, when it happened, what was felt, what was seen, who was there, what made it distinct. But the hippocampus does not preserve everything in equal detail forever. Over time, memories are reorganized and integrated into broader networks across the brain. Some become stable and detailed, many become more schematic. That means the general meaning or pattern may remain while the fine detail fades. This is useful because life would become impossible if every memory retained full detail indefinitely. You do not need an exact replay of every breakfast you have ever eaten. You need a general understanding of what breakfast is, how mornings work, and perhaps a few memorable exceptions involving travel, celebration, or a regrettable experiment with something labelled healthy. The brain is designed to keep the structure more reliably than the texture. It preserves meaning more readily than exactness. This explains a great deal about why time seems to speed up. As the brain accumulates more and more general models, it relies on them more heavily. It becomes better at gist, better at category, better at summary. Worse, if we can call it worse, at keeping the 100th instance of a repeated event separate from the 99 before it. Life begins to be stored in broader strokes. The years do not literally contain fewer days, but the memory system keeps fewer distinct internal divisions. This process is not only about aging in a biological sense, it is also about familiarity. A younger adult living through highly repetitive years can experience strong compression too. Meanwhile, an older adult going through a period of new learning, change, travel, or emotional significance may produce richly detailed memories that resist compression. So it is not simply that the brain ages and therefore loses detail. It is that the brain learns what kind of details it can safely stop preserving. The more stable and repeated life becomes, the stronger that tendency grows. There is also a difference between remembering a category and remembering an episode. Category memory says, "In those years I used to walk that route to work." Episodic memory says, "One morning on that route it had just rained. The pavement was reflecting the light, and I saw a child in a yellow coat dragging a stick along the railings while someone nearby laughed." The first kind of memory is broad and useful. The second kind is specific and vivid. Over time, many episodic memories lose detail and slide toward category memory. The route remains. The hundreds of specific mornings dissolve. That shift matters because category memory takes up less subjective space than episodic memory. A category can cover years with a single mental label. When I lived there, when the children were small, that period of commuting, my university years, the years in that flat. Such labels are efficient, but they flatten detail. When looking back, a category can feel short because it contains fewer accessible moments than the actual life it covered. This is one reason people are often startled when an old photograph reactivates forgotten detail. Suddenly a whole season seems to expand. A shirt, a room, a facial expression, the arrangement of furniture, the weather, the feeling of that age, a person's voice half returning through memory. The photograph does not create those things from nothing. It acts more like a key to files that had been stored in compressed form. Once retrieved, the period can briefly feel larger because more of its texture becomes available. The brain's filing system is also shaped by relevance. Memories that connect strongly to identity, emotion, goals, danger, or unresolved questions are more likely to be stored distinctly. Memories that do not appear useful in those ways are more likely to fade into general summary. This means that as adults build stable identities and stable responsibilities, many ordinary experiences become less uniquely relevant. They support the same ongoing roles rather than redefining them. Again, this is not unimportant. It simply produces lighter storage. Suppose someone is raising young children. Thousands of repeated acts may be full of love, care, labour, and emotional significance. Bedtimes, meals, baths, school runs, stories, laundry, tidying, comforting, explaining, carrying, repeating explanations that feel suspiciously identical to the previous explanation. Each act matters, but because many of them are structurally similar and performed under conditions of fatigue and divided attention, the brain may not store each one distinctly. Later, those years can feel both immensely important and strangely blurred. The importance remained. The detail thinned. The filing system grouped what it could. The same is true of many kinds of work. Repeated effort does not guarantee detailed memory. In fact, repeated effort under pressure often encourages stronger summarization. The brain stores the pattern and the emotional tone more than the individual instances. Those were very busy years. I was exhausted all the time. That job consumed so much of my life. These statements are often accurate, but they are category-level memories. The day-by-day detail has mostly been compressed. Sleep, stress, and attention all influence how much detail is stored in the first place. Poor sleep can weaken memory formation. Chronic stress can narrow attention and reduce the richness of encoding, even while making certain emotional elements more sticky. Multitasking spreads attention thinly, which means fewer details are properly bound together into coherent episodes. Fatigue makes everything more summary-like. When adults say the years went by in a blur, this is sometimes not metaphorical at all. Blur is exactly what happens when life is encoded under tired, distracted, stressed conditions and then filed under broad patterns. There is also a phenomenon called semanticization, which sounds far more severe than it is. It refers to the way specific episodic memories can gradually become more like general knowledge. Instead of remembering a particular event in full context, you remember the gist of what kind of thing used to happen. For example, rather than recalling one exact dinner at your grandparents' house, you may retain a broader sense of what dinners there were like. The smell, the table, the rhythm, the atmosphere, perhaps a few standout incidents. Over time, the many separate dinners become one enduring pattern. Semanticization is useful. It lets the brain extract meaning and structure from repeated life. But it also contributes to the shrinking of subjective time. Many lived events get distilled into a single general memory. The experiences remain real, yet they occupy less retrospective volume. This is why repeated years can feel so alarmingly small. The memory system has taken hundreds of episodes and transformed them into a manageable concept. That was a good time. That was a hard season. That was when life was simple. That was when everything revolved around work. These summary judgments are emotionally powerful, sometimes painfully so, but they do not preserve much internal detail. A whole era becomes a sentence. Another part of the filing system involves retrieval. Memories that are not revisited tend to become harder to access in detail. This does not necessarily mean they are gone entirely, but without retrieval cues, they remain buried under more recent and more relevant material. The adult brain is handling a great deal. New obligations, new information, newer memories, ongoing concerns. Older ordinary details are often not prioritized. Unless something calls them back, a smell, a place, a conversation, a photograph, a song, they remain compressed. Since they are hard to retrieve, the period they belong to may feel shorter than it was. This helps explain a familiar experience. Someone returns to a street they have not seen in years, or hears a song from a particular period, and suddenly a whole forgotten layer of life comes flooding back. Not just facts, but atmosphere, texture, tone, the emotional weather of that age. It can feel almost shocking because the compressed file opens and reveals far more content than was accessible moments before. What seemed small becomes briefly immense again. So the apparent shrinking of time is not always about loss. Sometimes it is about inaccessibility. The memory system has archived the details in ways that are not readily available during ordinary recall. The result is that life appears thinner than it actually was. As people get older, the sheer volume of archived experience increases. There are more categories, more repeated patterns, more summary files, more broad chapters in which many detailed episodes have been absorbed into the general shape of things. This means that the contrast between current experience and stored experience changes. New years enter an already crowded archive. To stand out, they must either differ strongly, carry high emotional weight, or be actively noticed and revisited. Otherwise, they too slide into the broad folders. This can create the unsettling sense that recent years are harder to separate. One Christmas blends into another, one spring into the next, one work cycle into the next. A whole stretch of adulthood may later appear as one long "when I was doing that." The brain has not been careless, it has been efficient. But efficiency can feel merciless when viewed from the inside of a limited life. There is, however, something oddly reassuring in understanding this. It means the speeding up of time is not always a sign that life has become empty, or that the years were somehow stolen. Often it means the brain has summarized repeated life in the way it was designed to do. The compression is psychological, not moral. It tells you something about how memory works, not about whether your life mattered. Still, if the filing system naturally reduces detail over time, that raises an important question. Can anything help preserve more detail? Can ordinary life resist being filed only under broad summary? To some degree, yes. The brain tends to keep more detail when experiences are novel, emotionally meaningful, attentively lived and occasionally revisited. Reflection helps, conversation helps, photographs help, journaling helps. Deliberately noticing distinct features of ordinary days can help. None of these turn memory into a perfect archive, but they can slow the conversion of life into pure category. A person who pauses to notice the particular shape of a day, the weather, the feeling, the place, the odd thing someone said, the arrangement of light in the room, is more likely to retain that day as an episode rather than as another example of a general type. Even small acts of recall strengthen distinctness. Telling someone about a walk, writing down a few observations at night, taking a picture not for display but for remembering, all of these can give the filing system more labels and more internal separation. This does not mean one must preserve everything. That would become its own exhausting project, and one suspects the brain would file that too under slightly neurotic attempts to outwit time. The point is simply that detail is more likely to remain available when life is lived with enough attention and enough occasional retrieval to resist immediate summary. And this brings us closer to another important part of the picture. The brain's filing system explains why detail fades and broad patterns remain, but memory is not only shaped by storage, it is also shaped by the body that produces it. The brain is not floating abstractly above life-keeping notes. It is housed in an aging organism with rhythms, speeds, limits, and biological changes of its own. Those changes may also influence why time begins to feel different as the years go on. Time is not only something we think about or remember, it is something the body keeps, quietly and constantly, whether we notice it or not. Beneath thoughts, beneath plans, beneath calendars and clocks, there is a rhythm running through the body itself. It regulates sleep and wakefulness, energy and fatigue, hunger and digestion, alertness and rest. This internal rhythm does not always match the way we schedule our lives, but it plays a powerful role in how time feels from the inside. and as the body changes with age, so does that rhythm. Those changes can subtly influence the sense that time is moving differently, even if we rarely stop to consider the biological layer beneath the psychological one. To begin with, the body operates on cycles. The most well-known of these is the circadian rhythm, a roughly 24-hour cycle that influences sleep, hormone release, body temperature, and many aspects of physical and mental functioning. This rhythm is guided by signals in the brain, particularly in a small region that responds to light and helps coordinate daily patterns. When morning light reaches the eyes, it helps reset this internal clock. When evening comes, the body begins preparing for rest, releasing hormones that encourage sleepiness and lowering certain forms of activity. In childhood, this rhythm is often quite strong and closely aligned with natural cues. Children tend to feel sleep more directly. They may resist it, of course, but when tiredness arrives, it often arrives clearly. Hunger is felt more immediately. Energy can rise and fall in pronounced waves. The body's signals are less masked by habit, caffeine, obligation, or long-term scheduling pressures. Because of this, the passage of a day can feel more physically grounded. Morning feels like morning, afternoon like afternoon, evening like evening. The rhythm is distinct. As people age, the relationship with these rhythms often becomes more complicated. Sleep patterns may shift. Some people find themselves waking earlier. Others struggle to fall asleep. The quality of sleep can change. Hormonal cycles alter. Energy levels may become less predictable. Responsibilities may override natural signals. You may stay awake later than your body prefers, wake earlier than it wants, eat at times that fit your schedule rather than your hunger, and push through fatigue because something needs to be done. Over time, this can blur the body's internal sense of time. When biological rhythms are less clearly felt or less closely followed, the structure of the day can become flatter. Instead of distinct phases with noticeable transitions, the day may feel more continuous, more uniform, less segmented by clear bodily signals. This flattening can contribute to the sense that time is passing quickly. Distinct phases help create mental markers. When those phases are less pronounced, fewer markers are formed. Metabolism also plays a role. In general terms, metabolism refers to the body's rate of energy use and the chemical processes that keep it functioning. In childhood and adolescence, metabolism is often higher. The body is growing, developing, building, changing. Energy is used rapidly. Physical sensations can be more intense and more immediate. Movement feels different. Recovery feels different. The body is in a state of active construction. As people get older, metabolism tends to slow gradually. This does not mean that the body becomes inactive or incapable, but the pace of internal processes changes. Energy may be used more steadily rather than in rapid bursts. Recovery from exertion may take longer. Physical changes occur more slowly and less dramatically. This shift can influence how time is experienced physically. A slower metabolic rhythm can create a more even, less sharply contrasted flow of sensation. This connects to the broader idea of biological pacing. When the body changes quickly, as it does in childhood, time is often marked by visible transformation. You grow taller, you learn new physical skills, your abilities expand rapidly. Clothes stop fitting at a rate that seems almost intentional. These changes provide clear markers. You can look at yourself and see that time has passed. The body itself becomes a calendar. In adulthood, physical change often becomes more gradual. It still occurs, of course, but it is less dramatic on a day-to-day or even year-to-year basis. Without these visible markers, time may feel less segmented. You're not constantly noticing transformation in the same way. The body becomes more stable, and that stability, while valuable, reduces one source of temporal awareness. There is also the matter of neural processing speed. Some researchers suggest that the brain's speed of processing sensory information may change over time. If the brain processes fewer distinct units of information in a given period, the experience of that period may feel shorter. This is not a simple or fully settled explanation. but it offers a useful perspective. If childhood involves processing a high volume of new information rapidly, and adulthood involves more efficient, less detailed processing of familiar information, then the same amount of clock time could feel different simply because of how much is being internally registered. This idea connects back to attention and novelty. The body and brain together determine how much information is taken in, how quickly it is processed, and how it is stored. A younger brain encountering new experiences may generate a high density of internal events. An older brain moving through familiar patterns may generate fewer distinct events. If time is partly measured by the number of perceived changes, then fewer changes can mean a shorter subjective duration. Another biological factor is the way hormones influence mood and energy. Hormones play a role in regulating alertness, motivation, stress, and emotional response. In younger individuals, hormonal fluctuations can be more pronounced, leading to stronger shifts in mood and energy. These shifts can create variation in experience, which, as we've seen, tends to expand the sense of time. As hormonal patterns stabilize or change with age, emotional and energetic fluctuations may become more moderate or more predictable. This can be beneficial in many ways. It can lead to greater emotional stability and resilience, but it can also reduce the contrast between different states. Less contrast means fewer distinct markers, and fewer markers can contribute to the feeling of time passing quickly. The body's response to novelty also changes over time. Novel experiences often trigger stronger physiological reactions in younger individuals. Heart rate may increase, attention sharpens, the body prepares for action. These responses make experiences feel vivid and significant. Over time, as the brain becomes more familiar with a wider range of situations, these reactions may become less intense. The same level of novelty may not produce the same level of physiological engagement. This can make experiences feel less dramatic, and therefore less memorable. Sleep is another important piece of the biological puzzle. Sleep is not just rest. It is a critical period for memory consolidation, the process by which experiences are organized and stored. During sleep, the brain replays and strengthens certain patterns, helping to move information from short-term to longer-term storage. Changes in sleep quality or duration can affect how well memories are formed and retained. In younger years, sleep is often deeper and more consistent, although not always appreciated. In adulthood, sleep can become more fragmented or less restorative. Even small disruptions can affect memory formation. If fewer experiences are consolidated effectively, the result can be a thinner memory record. And as we have seen, a thinner memory record contributes to a compressed sense of time. There is also the role of fatigue. Chronic fatigue, whether physical or mental, can reduce the richness of experience. When tired, attention narrows, sensory detail is less vivid. Emotional response may be blunted. The brain prioritizes basic functioning over detailed encoding. Days lived under fatigue may feel heavy in the moment and light in memory. This combination can make time feel both slow and fast. Slow while you're enduring it, fast when you look back. Another biological rhythm worth noting is the ultradian rhythm, shorter cycles that occur throughout the day, typically lasting about 90 minutes. These cycles influence periods of alertness and rest within the day. In ideal conditions, the body moves through waves of focus and recovery. However, modern life often disrupts these natural cycles. Continuous work, constant stimulation, and irregular breaks can flatten these rhythms. When the body's natural ebb and flow is ignored, the day can feel less varied. Less variation again means fewer markers, and fewer markers contribute to the sense of time speeding up. There is also the relationship between the body and the environment. Exposure to natural light, physical movement, and sensory variation all influence biological rhythms. In childhood, people often spend more time in varied environments, playing outside, moving through different spaces, experiencing changing conditions. In adulthood, especially in structured work environments, time may be spent in more uniform settings with artificial lighting and limited physical variation. This environmental sameness can reinforce the internal flattening of time. The body also keeps track of time through routines. Eating at regular intervals, sleeping at regular times, engaging in repeated activities, all create a sense of temporal structure. These routines are helpful, but when they become too uniform, they can reduce the body's sensitivity to change. The day becomes predictable not only mentally but physically. Predictability reduces the need for the body to signal transitions strongly. Without strong signals, the experience of time becomes smoother and less distinct. As people age, there is also a shift in how the body responds to effort and recovery. Activities that once felt effortless may require more energy. Recovery may take longer. This can influence how time is allocated and experienced. There may be fewer spontaneous bursts of activity and more planned or necessary actions. This can reduce the number of varied experiences within a given period, again contributing to compression. It is also worth considering the role of long-term biological changes. Aging involves gradual changes in many systems: cardiovascular, neurological, hormonal, musculoskeletal. These changes do not necessarily make life worse, but they alter the pace and texture of physical experience. The body becomes more stable in some ways and more limited in others. This can lead to a different relationship with time. Activities may be chosen more carefully. Energy may be managed more deliberately. The rhythm of life may become more measured. This measured rhythm can feel faster in retrospect because it is less punctuated by dramatic physical changes. Childhood and adolescence are marked by rapid development. Adulthood is marked by maintenance and gradual change. Maintenance does not create the same sense of progression as rapid development. Without clear markers of change, time can seem to pass more quickly. There is also the subtle influence of habit on the body. Habits are physical as well as mental. The body learns patterns of movement, posture, timing, and response. These patterns become automatic. Automatic behavior requires less conscious attention, which, as we have seen, leads to less detailed memory. The body's efficiency supports the brain's efficiency, and together they create a streamlined experience that can feel compressed. All of these biological factors interact with the psychological ones. The body provides the rhythm, the brain interprets it, and together they create the lived experience of time. When rhythms are clear, varied, and aligned with natural cycles, time may feel more structured and expansive. When rhythms are flattened, disrupted, or dominated by routine, time may feel smoother and faster. It is important to note that none of this means that aging inevitably leads to a diminished experience of time. The body changes, but it also adapts. Awareness of these changes can allow for adjustments. Paying attention to sleep, movement, light and rest can help maintain clearer rhythms. Engaging with the body rather than ignoring it can bring back some of the variation that supports a richer sense of time. The body is not separate from the experience of time, it is one of the ways time is felt. When the body's signals are clear, time has texture. When those signals are muted or overridden, time can become less distinct. Understanding this connection helps explain why time may feel different as the years go on, and it points toward the next layer of the puzzle. Because beyond biology, beyond memory, beyond attention and emotion, there is also a simple mathematical perspective that quietly shapes how we experience the passage of years. There is a very simple idea that often surprises people when they first hear it, not because it is complicated, but because it feels immediately true in a way that is difficult to ignore. A year does not feel the same at every age, not just because of memory, attention, or emotion, but because of proportion. The same unit of time becomes a smaller piece of your life as your life gets longer, and that change in proportion can quietly alter how time is experienced. When you're 5 years old, 1 year is 1/5 of your entire life. That is a large fraction. It is not a small addition to a long sequence. It is a significant portion of everything you have ever known. When you are 10, a year is 1/10, still substantial. At 20, it is 1/20th. At 40, 1/40th. At 60, 1/60th. The same 12 months do not shrink in objective length, but they shrink relative to the whole of your lived experience. This is what is often called the ratio effect. It is not a complete explanation for why time seems to speed up, but it adds an important layer to the picture. Human perception does not operate in absolute units alone. It operates in comparison. We understand size, duration, and change partly by relating them to what we already know. A year does not exist in isolation in the mind. It exists against the background of all the years that came before it. In childhood, that background is small. Each new year represents a large expansion of experience. It changes what life feels like in a noticeable way. You're not just adding another year, you're significantly increasing the total amount of time you have lived. The difference between being 5 and 6 is not trivial. It is a 20% increase in your life experience. The difference between being 6 and 7 is also large. These changes are felt because they alter the scale of everything you know. In adulthood, the addition of a single year changes the overall picture much less. Going from 40 to 41 does not dramatically alter the proportion of life lived. It is a small increment in a much larger total. Because the relative change is smaller, it can feel less significant. The year blends more easily into the background of accumulated time. This effect becomes clearer when you think about how the mind measures change. The brain is sensitive to differences. Large differences are easier to detect than small ones. When a new year represents a large percentage of your total life, it stands out. When it represents a small percentage, it is easier for it to pass without creating a strong sense of difference. This does not mean that a year in adulthood is less important or less full of events. It means that its relative weight in the context of your entire life is smaller. The brain, which is constantly comparing and contextualizing, may register it as less distinct simply because it does not shift the overall picture very much. There is a simple analogy that can help make this clearer. Imagine adding a cup of water to a small glass. The change is obvious. The level rises noticeably. Now imagine adding the same cup of water to a large tank. The change is much harder to see. The amount added is the same, but the context is different. Your life is the tank and each year is the cup. As the tank grows, each addition becomes less visually dramatic. This proportional perspective interacts with everything else we have discussed. Memory, attention, novelty, repetition, and emotion all shape how time is experienced, but they do so within the framework of accumulated life. The larger that framework becomes, the easier it is for new experiences to be absorbed without dramatically altering the overall sense of duration. It is also worth noting that this effect is not purely mathematical, it is psychological. The brain does not calculate exact fractions and then decide how to feel about time. Instead, it uses patterns, comparisons, and general impressions, but the underlying principle still applies. Relative size influences perception. This is one reason why childhood memories can feel so large. Not only were those experiences often novel and richly encoded, but they also occupied a larger proportion of the total life at the time. A summer at age 8 was not just a season. It was a significant portion of everything you had lived so far. That gives it weight. It gives it presence. In adulthood, even a meaningful year may feel smaller in retrospect because it is one of many similar units. It may be full of important events, but it does not stand out as dramatically against the backdrop of decades. It becomes part of a larger pattern. This can create a sense that time is accelerating. Each year feels shorter because it is a smaller piece of the whole. The effect is subtle but cumulative. As more years are added, each new year contributes less to the overall change in perspective. The result is that time appears to pass more quickly, even though the actual duration remains constant. There is also an interaction between the ratio effect and memory compression. As the brain groups repeated experiences into categories, entire years can be stored as single units of meaning. When those units are already small relative to the total life, they can feel even smaller. A year becomes a label rather than a sequence of detailed experiences. For example, someone might think of a period of life as the years I worked there, or the time when the children were young. These labels may cover several years, but they are stored as single concepts. The ratio effect then makes each of those years feel smaller within the larger narrative. The combination of compression and proportion can make time seem to shrink rapidly. It is important to recognize that this effect is not something that can be reversed. The proportion of a year relative to your life will always decrease as you age. That is simply a consequence of accumulating time. However, understanding this can help explain why the feeling of acceleration occurs. It is not that time is actually speeding up. It is that each unit of time is being compared against a larger and larger background. This understanding can also shift how people think about the passage of time. Instead of seeing the acceleration as something mysterious or troubling, it can be seen as a natural outcome of growth. As life expands, each part becomes a smaller fraction of the whole. This is not a loss, it is a change in perspective. At the same time, the ratio effect highlights the importance of how time is experienced within those units. If each year feels smaller in proportion, then the quality of experience within that year becomes more significant. The brain may not assign it as much weight relative to the whole, but it can still be rich, detailed, and meaningful in its own right. This brings us back to the earlier ideas about attention, novelty, and memory. While the ratio effect cannot be altered, the density of experience within a year can. A year filled with varied, attended, and emotionally meaningful experiences can feel larger than a year filled with repetition and distraction, even if both represent the same fraction of life. There is also a subtle psychological benefit to understanding the ratio effect. It can help reduce the sense that something is wrong when time feels fast. Many people interpret this feeling as a sign that life is slipping away, or that they are not making the most of it. While those concerns can be valid in some cases, the ratio effect suggests that part of the experience is simply a natural consequence of aging. The perception of time changes because the context changes. This does not mean that nothing can be done to influence how time feels. It means that expectations can be adjusted. Instead of expecting each year to feel as large as it did in childhood, it may be more helpful to focus on the richness of individual experiences. The goal is not to make time feel slow in the same way it did when you were young, but to ensure that it does not become so compressed that it feels as though it has disappeared. Another way to think about this is to consider how the brain marks significant periods. Even within the framework of the ratio effect, certain years stand out. They are remembered clearly because they contain distinct events, strong emotions, or meaningful changes. These years resist the shrinking effect because they create their own internal structure. This suggests that while the proportion of a year cannot be changed, its internal composition can. A year that is segmented by meaningful experiences will feel different from a year that is uniform. The ratio effect sets the baseline, but other factors determine how much of that baseline is actually felt. It's also interesting to consider how the ratio effect interacts with anticipation and reflection. In childhood, anticipation often stretches time because future events represent a large portion of life. Waiting for a birthday or a holiday feels significant because it occupies a meaningful fraction of your experience. In adulthood, anticipation may feel shorter because the same waiting period represents a smaller portion of life. Reflection works in a similar way. Looking back on a childhood year feels expansive because it was a large part of a smaller whole. Looking back on an adult year may feel more compact because it is one of many. This does not diminish the importance of adult experiences, it simply changes how they are perceived in relation to the whole. Understanding this can help people appreciate the difference between objective time and subjective time. The clock measures one, the mind interprets the other. There is a quiet acceptance that comes with recognizing this pattern. Time will not feel the same at every stage of life, and that is not necessarily a problem to be solved. It is a feature of how perception works. Each stage has its own texture, its own way of shaping experience. And once this is understood, it becomes easier to ask a different kind of question. Not how to make time feel exactly as it did before, but how to work with the way it feels now. Because even within the constraints of proportion, memory, and biology, there are still ways to influence the richness and clarity of lived experience. People often ask this question with a mixture of hope and resignation. Can we slow it down? Can anything be done about that strange acceleration that seems to arrive with adulthood when months slip by quickly and years begin to feel as though they are folded too tightly? The honest answer is that we cannot slow time in the literal sense. The clock will go on being the clock, stubborn and unimpressed by our intentions, but the feeling of time is another matter. That can change. Not completely, not permanently, and not by magic, but enough to matter. Because much of what makes time seem fast is not the speed of time itself. It is the compression of experience. And if experience can be made richer, more distinct and more fully noticed, then life can begin to feel larger again from the inside. This is not about turning every day into an adventure, which would be exhausting and probably lead to a regrettable number of purchases involving backpacks. It is also not about forcing yourself to live in a permanent state of spiritual appreciation for every teaspoon and traffic light. The point is gentler than that. The feeling of time expands when life contains more distinction, more attention, more novelty, more emotional presence, more memory markers, and more contact with the body's natural rhythms. That means there are habits, often quite ordinary ones, that can make time feel less slippery. The first and perhaps most important habit is paying fuller attention to what is already there. This sounds almost too simple, which is unfortunate because simple things are often dismissed in favour of more glamorous nonsense. But attention is one of the main ingredients in lived time. What you notice becomes part of experience. What you do not notice often passes through you, almost without leaving a trace. A day can be full of activity and still feel strangely empty afterward if you were never truly present for it. Paying attention does not mean straining heroically to observe every detail of life until you become unbearable at dinner. It means allowing some moments to be actually inhabited rather than merely pass through, drinking tea while tasting it, walking while seeing where you are, listening to someone without mentally composing your reply halfway through their sentence, noticing the weather, the room, the sound of a person laughing, the pattern of light on a wall at a particular time. Small acts of noticing create texture, and texture gives memory something to hold. One useful habit, then, is to create little islands of undivided attention during the day. They do not need to be long. 5 minutes with no phone while drinking coffee. A walk taken without audio in your ears for part of it. A meal where you actually sit down instead of orbiting the kitchen like a worried satellite. A conversation in which you let yourself remain in the conversation instead of mentally fleeing into tomorrow. These are not dramatic acts, but they oppose compression. They help the day resist becoming one more smooth blur. A second habit is introducing modest novelty on purpose. The brain wakes up when something is not entirely the same. This does not require reinventing your life every month, which is not a sustainable habit unless your actual hobby is logistical instability. It means changing enough that the mind cannot file everything under usual. Take a different route. Visit a place nearby that you have somehow never entered. Read outside your normal preferences. Cook something unfamiliar. Rearrange a room. Speak to someone you usually only nod at. Try a class, a hobby, or a skill that puts you back into the useful and slightly awkward position of being a beginner. Small novelty matters more than people think. The brain does not need world travel in order to stop summarizing. It needs distinction. It needs moments that feel different enough to merit separate storage. Even small changes can create those moments. A familiar week with one truly different afternoon often feels larger than a perfectly smooth week made entirely of repeated tasks. Distinction breaks the spell of summary. There is also value in seasonal novelty, because one reason years blur is that the repeating structure of seasons can become too automatic. A simple habit of doing one new thing each season can help create memory anchors. A spring walk in a place you have not seen before, a summer evening ritual, an autumn trip to somewhere small but different, a winter practice you only do then. These do not have to be grand traditions with embroidered napkins and family politics. They just need to stand out enough that the year has internal shape. A third habit is reducing autopilot where possible. Autopilot is efficient, and no one should aim to eliminate it entirely. If you had to consciously negotiate every shoelace and cupboard door, life would collapse before breakfast. But many adult days are overrun by automatic behaviour. You wake, scroll, wash, answer, rush, respond, repeat. Whole portions of life occur in a semi-absent state. The result is that the days get done, but they are barely encoded. One way to interrupt autopilot is to place small points of deliberate awareness into routines that already exist. If you always make tea in the morning, make that 1 minute more conscious. If you commute, notice one thing each day you would normally ignore. If you cook, slow down enough to smell and look and register the act rather than treating it as a nuisance between tasks. Routine does not have to be the enemy. Unnoticed routine is the problem. A noticed routine can become part of lived time rather than dead passage. A fourth habit is engaging with memory on purpose. The brain files life more distinctly when experience is revisited occasionally. This does not mean becoming an archivist of your own existence with labelled drawers for every sandwich. It means allowing some events to be named, reflected on, and recalled. Journaling is one obvious example, but it need not be elaborate. A few lines at the end of the day about what stood out, what felt strange, what was good, what was difficult, what you do not want to forget. This helps separate one day from the next. It tells the brain, this day had its own contents. Photographs can help too, if used for remembering rather than constant performance. A photo of a place, a table, a sky, a face, a book you were reading in a certain room. Not everything needs to be documented, and heaven knows the world does not need one more image of a mediocre pastry from 6 angles. But a few deliberate images can later reopen detail that would otherwise be compressed. They become retrieval cues. They let the brain recover texture. Conversation is another powerful form of memory making. Telling someone about your day, your walk, your odd observation, your small success, your ridiculous inconvenience, can help turn passing experience into stored experience. Human beings remember in narrative form. When something is told, it often becomes more distinct. This is one reason periods of life with strong conversation and shared storytelling often feel larger in retrospect. The events were not only lived, they were spoken into shape. A fifth habit is protecting sleep and bodily rhythm more seriously than many adults tend to. This is not glamorous advice, which is part of why people resist it until their bodies stage a formal complaint. But sleep affects attention, emotion, energy, memory formation, and the sense of time itself. A tired brain encodes less richly. An exhausted person lives in narrower focus. Poor sleep makes days blur and makes memory thin. Better sleep will not suddenly make Wednesday majestic, but it does increase the chances that life is experienced in higher resolution. Light exposure, physical movement, and regular periods of rest also matter here. The body keeps time through rhythm. When your rhythm is flattened by indoor sameness, constant screen light, irregular sleep, and uninterrupted pressure, the day loses shape. Morning light helps create distinction between biological day and night. Movement changes the body's state and can segment time more clearly. Real breaks matter because without them the day becomes one continuous slab of effort. Slabs are memorable only in the way concrete is memorable, which is to say, not very helpfully. A sixth habit is giving the week some variation in structure. One reason adult life compresses is that the architecture of time becomes too uniform. Monday resembles Tuesday, Tuesday resembles Wednesday, and before long the entire month has the internal shape of beige wallpaper. Without variation, the brain has little basis for separating one stretch from another. This does not mean the week must become a masterpiece of optimization. It means it helps if not every day feels identical in flow. Perhaps one evening is for reading somewhere specific. One morning is for a slower breakfast. One afternoon is for going out rather than staying in. One day contains a longer walk. One part of the week includes meeting someone, learning something, going somewhere, or doing a task at a different pace. Distinct rhythms create distinct memories. Even if your obligations are fixed, small shifts in how time is held can make the week feel more segmented and therefore larger. A seventh habit is allowing emotion to register instead of living in constant low-level numbness. This is not an invitation to become wildly theatrical about weather or spreadsheets. It means that feeling is part of what gives time shape. Joy that is actually felt. Relief that is acknowledged. Grief that is not endlessly postponed. Tenderness that is noticed. Delight that is not brushed aside. These things create memory landmarks. A life that is emotionally flattened may become efficient, but it also becomes hard to remember clearly. Numbness is one of time's favourite accomplices. This is especially important in modern adult life, because many people live in a state of functional emotional postponement. They keep going, they handle things, they postpone reaction because there is no room to stop. That may be necessary at times, but over the long term it can make years feel thin. Feeling what is there, even briefly and quietly, helps life become more substantial in memory. You do not need melodrama, you need contact. An eighth habit is doing things that produce flow, the state in which attention is fully engaged by something that is neither too easy nor too overwhelming. Flow is one of the healthiest ways time changes shape. In the moment, it can make hours pass quickly. In retrospect, it often makes experience feel full. Creative work, music, writing, gardening, building, running, solving problems, making something with your hands, learning a language, repairing something, drawing, reading deeply, cooking with real attention. These kinds of absorbed activities often enlarge the feeling of life because they are richly attended and internally satisfying. Many adults drift away from flow and into passive recovery instead. They work, grow tired, and then default into low attention rest that may be understandable but not memorable. There is nothing wrong with collapsing on the sofa now and then. Civilization itself may depend on it. But a life made mostly of obligation followed by passive recovery can become highly compressible. Flow creates better mental texture than numb consumption. It is not about productivity. It is about engagement. A ninth habit is making room for actual boredom sometimes. This may sound odd in a discussion about slowing time down, but boredom does two useful things. First, it stretches time in the moment because attention has fewer places to go. Second, it creates space for imagination, reflection, and the reappearance of neglected thoughts. Constant stimulation smooths the day too much. Every idle moment is filled before it can become anything. As a result, one moves from distraction to distraction without much internal contrast. Allowing the occasional unstimulated interval, sitting, waiting, walking, resting without instantly reaching for a device, can help restore some roughness to time. Roughness is useful. It gives the day shape. It allows your own thoughts to become noticeable again, which is occasionally alarming but often valuable. A 10th habit is marking transitions. Human beings benefit from rituals not because rituals are magical, but because they create separation. Beginning and ending things clearly makes time feel more structured. If you start work in one way and end it in another, the day has boundaries. If meals are treated as pauses instead of accidental fueling events, the day has divisions. If evening is acknowledged as evening rather than just more daytime with worse lighting, time regains contour. These rituals can be very small: lighting a lamp, closing a notebook, putting away devices for an hour, changing rooms, taking a short walk after work, making tea at the same time, stretching, opening a window. The content matters less than the distinction. Boundaries help memory. Boundaries resist blur. A life with no transitions becomes one long ongoingness, and ongoingness disappears quickly. An 11th habit is looking back occasionally with specificity. Once a week, once a month, once a season, it can help to ask, What actually happened here? Not in the abstract, but in detail. What stood out? What changed? What was difficult? What surprised me? What did I enjoy? What did I learn? What would otherwise be lost? This kind of reflection expands time because it recovers content that would otherwise collapse into summary. You begin to see that the week was not just busy. It contained a strange conversation, a useful idea, a good meal, a tired afternoon, a moment of relief, a walk in cold air, a small decision that mattered. Reflection returns granularity. Without granularity, all life becomes labels. Busy month, hard year, nice holiday, stressful season. Labels are efficient but poor company. Details are what make time feel lived. A 12th habit, and perhaps the most generous one, is to stop expecting life to feel slow in the same way it did in childhood. This matters because many adults secretly compare current time to remembered childhood time and conclude that something has gone wrong. But childhood was large for reasons that cannot be fully recreated. The world was newer, the proportions were different, the body was changing quickly, emotions were fresh, and life was not yet built around adult responsibility. It is not a failure that 40 does not feel like 8. It would in fact be highly impractical. The aim is not to return to childhood time. The aim is to resist needless compression, to let adult life become fuller, more noticed, more segmented, more inhabited. The pace may still feel quicker than it once did, but quicker does not have to mean empty. A year may be 1/40th or 1/50th of a life, and still contain enough texture to feel real. This is where people often become discouraged. They hear suggestions about attention, novelty, sleep, rhythm, memory, reflection, and they think, so the answer is to manage myself perfectly. It is not. Perfection is one of the dullest ideas ever introduced into human self-understanding. The point is not to become flawless at living. The point is to remember that time expands through texture, and texture can be created imperfectly. A slightly more noticed life is already different from an unnoticed one. One new thing a week matters. One fully inhabited meal matters. One day with a different rhythm matters. One conversation honestly felt matters. Small distinctions accumulate, and they accumulate not only in memory, but in identity. A person who keeps introducing attention and variation into life builds a denser sense of self over time. Not necessarily a more glamorous self, not a self that needs a special hat, but a self with more contact with experience. That contact is what keeps life from dissolving too quickly into category and summary. There is something comforting in this, I think. The speeding up of time is not entirely beyond reach, even if the calendar itself cannot be argued with. We cannot ask years to become objectively longer, and they would ignore us if we tried. But we can change whether they arrive smooth and forgettable, or textured enough to leave behind shape. We can choose some habits that encourage life to be stored with more edges, which means the question is not really whether we can stop time from moving. We cannot. The question is whether we can live in such a way that time does not vanish as completely while it moves. And the answer to that is yes, at least a little, and often in surprisingly ordinary ways. Which leads naturally to the last quiet thought in all this. If time does seem to speed up, if years do become smaller, and life more compressible, then perhaps what matters most is not how to defeat that fact, but how to live meaningfully inside it. There is a quiet sadness in realizing that time does not feel the same forever. Most people sense it long before they can explain it. A year once felt large. A season once seemed to unfold with patience. Waiting used to be enormous. Summers stretched. Holidays took ages to arrive. Afternoons had room in them. Then, slowly, without ceremony, life began to feel different. The calendar started moving with a little more confidence than seemed appropriate. One birthday returned too quickly, then another. Whole years began slipping by with a kind of smooth efficiency that felt faintly suspicious. And somewhere in all of that, a very human question began to hover in the background. If time really does seem to speed up as we get older, then what matters most within it? That question is worth lingering with because it is not really a question about clocks. It is a question about life. Not about how many hours there are, but about what becomes meaningful when those hours start to feel more fragile, more condensed, more difficult to hold. It is the sort of question people do not always ask directly. Sometimes it appears in other forms. Why am I always rushing? Where did this year go? Why do the important things seem to get pushed aside by the necessary ones? Why do I remember certain tiny moments so clearly, while entire months seem to have dissolved? What am I meant to do with the fact that time moves whether I pay attention or not? One answer, perhaps the simplest and the hardest, is that what matters is not stopping time from speeding up. We cannot do that. The mind changes, the body changes, memory compresses, proportion shifts, routine takes over, and the years become smaller pieces of a larger whole. That is part of being alive. But within that truth there is another one, gentler and more useful. Even if we cannot stop time from moving, we can still change how fully life is met while it moves. And that begins to matter more and more as the years gather behind us. It is easy to imagine that what matters most must be something dramatic, a great achievement, a major decision, a defining event, a large and obvious answer that can be pointed to and named. And certainly some lives do turn on visible turning points. But most of life is not made from turning points. It is made from repetition, attention, relationship, and the countless small acts that seem ordinary while they are happening. This can feel disappointing when one is young and still expects importance to announce itself properly. Yet as time begins to feel quicker, many people discover something almost inconveniently modest. A meaningful life is not usually built from rare highlights alone. It is built from what is lived repeatedly and how consciously it is lived. That realization changes things. If time speeds up, then perhaps what matters is not merely how much we do, but what kind of contact we maintain with the life we're already in. Whether we notice, whether we show up, whether we let days become only machinery, only obligation, only sequence, whether we allow routine to become invisible or insist gently that even familiar life deserves some attention. There is a temptation, when time starts feeling fast, to become more desperate, to try to outrun the feeling by adding more plans, more goals, more experiences, more productivity, more proof that life is being used properly. But desperation rarely enlarges time. It usually makes it thinner. The more frantic the mind becomes, the less it actually registers. Days fill up and disappear. The schedule grows heavier and memory grows lighter. One runs faster and somehow arrives with less. So perhaps the answer is not to crowd life in order to make it matter, but to meet it more honestly while it is here. This honesty often begins with noticing what actually lasts in memory. It is rarely the whole to-do list, rarely the fully optimized day, rarely the week in which one responded to every message with terrifying efficiency. What lasts strangely often are small and particular things. The exact light in a room on a winter afternoon, someone laughing unexpectedly, a meal that was ordinary except for the feeling around it, the first warm day after a long cold stretch, a conversation on a doorstep, the smell of a familiar place, the relief of sitting down after a hard day, a child asking something serious in a voice still learning language, a parent repeating a phrase they have always said, a quiet walk when the mind finally softened enough to notice trees again. These moments are not always grand, but they are often what remain. That tells us something important. What matters within speeding time may be less about scale and more about depth. Not depth in the dramatic or philosophical sense alone, though those have their place, but depth of presence, depth of contact, depth of actually being there for the small portions of life that would otherwise vanish unnoticed. A life becomes meaningful in part through the quality of attention we give it. Not total attention, not impossible attention, but enough to keep it from becoming one long administrative blur. This also changes the way we think about love, which is perhaps one of the most important things time reveals. When people feel the years accelerating, they often begin to understand more sharply that love is not merely a feeling attached to special occasions. It is a pattern of presence. It is made of repeated actions, repeated patience, repeated listening, repeated care. It lives in cooking for people, asking again how they are, remembering what matters to them, showing up when tired, staying a little longer, forgiving more than one wanted to, trying again. Because time compresses repeated life so easily, it can be tempting to undervalue these acts. They do not always stand out dramatically, but they are often the true structure of a life. If time speeds up, then love may matter even more because it gives repeated time dignity. It keeps routine from becoming empty. It reminds us that the ordinary is not necessarily trivial. There is great meaning in being reliable to one another, great meaning in tenderness practiced over years, great meaning in making a home, however imperfectly, in another person's life. The calendar may not honour such things with fanfare, but memory often does in quiet ways. Long after the details of many busy weeks are gone, the feeling of being loved well, or of loving well, can remain astonishingly clear. There is something similar to be said about attention to beauty. Not the grand official kind alone, not only mountains and cathedrals and oceans at sunset, though heaven knows those help, but the ordinary beauty people stop seeing when life becomes hurried. The shape of steam rising from a mug, the colour of evening through a kitchen window, the strange dignity of laundry moving in wind, the softness of lamplight, the sound of rain arriving before one can fully see it, a dog sleeping without worry, the way an old hand holds a cup. These things do not stop time. They do something quieter. They return us to it. They make us occupy it again rather than merely moving through it. And perhaps that is one of the truest answers. What matters within speeding time is whatever returns us to actual experience, whatever interrupts summary, whatever reminds us that this hour is not just one more hour in a pile, but this one, with its own atmosphere, its own body, its own fleeting reality. A person can live many years and still miss much of life by never quite arriving in it. Yet a person can also live through ordinary days with enough awareness that those days begin to thicken, to resist disappearing completely. Of course, one cannot live like this constantly. No one can remain permanently awake to every detail without becoming exhausted or insufferable. Life requires habit, routine, distraction, efficiency, even dullness. The aim is not to become a saint of noticing. It is simply to remember that life does not ask to be spectacular in order to be real, and when time begins to feel fast, reality itself becomes precious. Not the fantasy of a better future life in which one will finally pay attention, but this one, this kitchen, this morning, this face, this season, this tired body, this unfinished conversation, this bit of weather, this age you happen to be. That last part matters more than people often admit. Time speeds up, yes, but part of the pain of that feeling comes from wanting another age while inhabiting the current one. Adults long for childhood spaciousness. The elderly may long for younger strength. The young rush toward adulthood, and then discover they have hurried into calendars. One can lose a great deal of life by always standing mentally in a different time than the one actually being lived. So perhaps one gentle task is to make some peace with the age one is. Not because every age is equally easy, and certainly not because regret is avoidable, but because this age too contains its own forms of life that cannot be met later. There are things visible only now, things understandable only now, forms of tenderness, patience, humour, clarity, grief, and gratitude that belong to this stage and no other. Childhood had wonder, yes, but adulthood may have depth. Youth had firsts, but later life may have perception. Earlier years had spaciousness, but older years may have sharper knowledge of what actually matters. Every age loses something. Every age also carries something. Time becomes less frightening when one stops demanding that the present feel like the past and starts asking what this present is able to give. This leads naturally to the question of purpose. If time speeds up, does purpose become more urgent? In one sense, yes, but not always in the loud way people imagine. Purpose is often presented as a grand mission, a singular destiny, something with branding and confidence and perhaps a website. For most human beings, purpose is humbler than that. It is found in usefulness, in devotion, in curiosity, in making and mending, in care, in learning, in contributing to the lives of others, in being awake enough to one's days that they are not all surrendered to drift. The speeding up of time can make purpose clearer because it removes some illusions. One begins to understand that not everything matters equally. Not every demand deserves obedience. Not every task is worth the whole of one's life. And that can be clarifying in a deep and necessary way. Time's apparent acceleration asks a quiet question of every adult, whether they phrase it or not. Given that life will not slow down on its own, what are you willing to let shape it? Anxiety, habit, other people's priorities, endless reaction, or something chosen, however modest. Something that gives the days a centre. This does not mean every life must become dramatic or radically transformed. But it does mean that unchosen momentum is dangerous. A life can vanish into momentum. A year can disappear into errands if nothing inside it is claimed as meaningful. At the same time, one must be careful here. There is a risk of turning this realization into yet another burden, yet another demand to live correctly, use time perfectly, optimize experience, extract meaning from every Tuesday until one becomes impossible to be around. That would miss the point entirely. What matters within speeding time is not perfection. It is not squeezing maximum significance from every second like some sort of spiritual fruit press. It is gentleness too. Rest matters. Idleness matters. Recovery matters. Aimless walks matter. Laughter that leads nowhere matters. Sitting beside someone without improving anything matters. A meaningful life is not one in which every minute earns its keep. It is one in which life is allowed to be fully human. This is especially important because the fear of time often drives people into harshness. Harshness toward themselves for not using life better. Harshness toward others for seeming to waste it. Harshness toward the ordinary because it does not look important enough. But life is mostly ordinary. The ordinary is where almost everything happens. Meals, friendships, work, parentheses of rest, small disappointments, repeated jokes, shared beds, long recoveries, tidying up, looking out windows, remembering things too late, trying again. If meaning cannot live there, it will not live anywhere reliable. And so perhaps what truly matters within speeding time is not defeating transience, but consenting to intimacy with life despite transience. To love what passes because it passes. To notice because the moment is not permanent. To care for things that cannot be kept. To build a life not from the fantasy of endless time, but from the reality of limited time honestly inhabited. That is not a tragic idea, though it may sound like one at first. It is also a tender one. Scarcity gives shape. Mortality gives urgency. The fleeting nature of life is not only what makes it sad, it is what makes it vivid. This becomes clearer in relationships. One day, often without warning, people we assumed would always be around are not. Places change, bodies age, voices alter, customs fade, houses empty, children grow, parents become fragile, friends move, seasons repeat but never identically. The speeding up of time is painful partly because it reveals that nothing can be held exactly as it is. But from that pain comes one of the wisest forms of attention, cherishing. Not clinging, not grasping, but cherishing. Knowing that this dinner, this holiday, this conversation, this walk home, this ordinary Tuesday with someone you love will not happen forever. And because it will not happen forever, it deserves a little presence now. If there is any quiet wisdom in feeling that time moves quickly, perhaps it is this. We are being reminded not to postpone life too completely, not to assume we will arrive later at the part where we finally notice what matters, not to spend every season preparing for the next one. There will always be another task, another problem, another reason to defer attention. But eventually the years become a stack, and what one misses is not usually having failed to answer one more message. It is having failed to be there for enough of one's own existence. That does not mean one should live in constant solemnity, as though every spoonful of soup must be received with reverence and a whispered philosophy. Life is far too funny and far too untidy for that. Humour matters too. In fact, humour may matter immensely. The ability to laugh at time's absurdities, the speed of holidays, the repetition of chores, the bizarre experience of becoming the age one once thought belonged only to proper adults, with mysterious opinions about upholstery, all of that helps. Humour is one of the ways human beings bear transience without becoming crushed by it. It brings lightness back into the fact of passing time. It reminds us that seriousness is not the only dignified response to mortality. Sometimes delight is. And maybe that is where all of this settles, at least for tonight. If time speeds up, what truly matters within it may be simpler than we fear and harder than we expect. To love people well. To notice life before it vanishes into summary. To allow routine to hold meaning instead of emptiness. To protect some portion of each day from complete unconsciousness. To keep curiosity alive. To make room for beauty. To feel what is felt. To rest without guilt. To choose what deserves your limited attention. To remember that ordinary life is not what happens in between life. It is life. The years may still move quickly. They probably will. A season will end before you feel ready. Another calendar page will turn with its usual audacity. You will likely continue to be startled by how recently and how long ago certain things were. That is part of the strange human bargain. But perhaps the gentlest comfort is that meaning does not require endless time. It requires contact, and contact remains possible now, even in a life that feels faster than it used to. So tonight, wherever you are, in whatever hour has gathered around you, perhaps that is enough to hold for now. Not a solution, not a victory over time, not a final answer polished into certainty. Just the thought that while time may keep slipping onward, there are still ways to meet it with warmth, attention, and a little more presence than yesterday, and even that small difference can change the shape of a life as the night grows quieter around it.